Today's tea time is an interesting one. This is a bit of a tough topic, a tricky topic, in fact, but I think it's just about time that we discuss it. We discuss the meta. What is the meta? The metagame. How does it affect the game? What's wrong with it? What's good about it? What should we do about it? All of these questions, probably more, will be answered today.
The way I think of meta is what is the most efficient way to clear this specific thing. And I think it's important to mention that this is different depending on what the goal of the group is for. Like if your goal is to speedrun the encounter and, like kill it in a world record like time or something like that, the meta for that type of goal is going to be very different from a meta for let's say new players that are trying out the encounter for the very first time.
If your concern is about winning and or about doing the best for your team and providing the most value and giving them the best shot at winning, when you look at these sort of lower effort builds, it's not, there's no argument.
Nike is joined to unchain, to unleash. He said that he's itching. The skin is itching. The keyboard is being randomly spammed. There was like some going on there. Unchain, unleash, do it. I've hit the button.
The button has been hit.
Yeah, the button has been hit, my friends. And that means TeaTime has activated.
Ah, yes, bottom left.
Yes, bottom left. That is where you are.
Bingo cards.
Yeah, that's how it goes. People look at it like, oh wow, look at where everyone is on TeaTime. Usually it's just where they were last. The first time is where you stay on TeaTime, right? That's pretty much the way it goes. But anyway, today's TeaTime is an interesting one. This is a bit of a tough topic, a tricky topic, in fact, but I think it's just about time that we discuss it. That we discuss the meta. What is the meta? The metagame in Guild Wars 2. What does that even mean? Okay, how does it affect the game? What's wrong with it? What's good about it? What should we do about it? All of these questions, and probably more, will be answered today by the finest minds in Guild Wars 2. That's Emmy. Okay, that's not me and Sneb. We're not too bad. But I think a good place to start with this, and I think one of the major issues that arises whenever this topic comes up, is actually definitions. Which, it sounds like we're going to have an academic debate today, my friends. It's academic conversation. But I think one of the really big problems when discussing the metagame is that you'll find that different people actually define meta differently, or rather that word means different things, actually. So let's just go ahead and open it right there. What do you guys think meta means? What does it mean when we say metagame?
I guess I can start. I think the way I think of meta is what is the most efficient way to clear this specific thing, whether it's PvP, Wolver's World, PvE, raids, dungeons, fractals, whatever it is. It was whatever takes the least amount of effort for the highest amount of reward. And I think it's important to mention that this is different depending on what the goal of the group is for. Like if your goal is to speedrun the encounter and, kill it in a world record like time or something like that, the meta for that type of goal is going to be very different from a meta for let's say new players that are trying out the encounter for the very first time. And I think I agree with you. I think this is where a lot of kind of the definition stuff kind of seeps in, and a lot of people don't realize that is that something that I'm just going to go ahead and say the M word, Mechanist, is extremely meta for a group of new players that have never seen the encounter, that need to digest a lot of information and all that kind of stuff. But for other for groups that are way more competent at the game, I guess, the classes that they run are probably not going to be Mechanists. It's going to be tailored for this specific encounter itself. So yeah,
that's true. I think I definitely agree with what you said there. I think you described it being essentially the best result for the lowest effort. I think that's actually the reasoning behind the meta. I would refer to the metagame as kind of what emerges because of that goal, right? And essentially that would be the metagame is not necessarily what's actually best or optimal. It's just what sees play. There can be really strong builds that don't see play because nobody knows about them, or this for whatever reason they're kind of difficult to play, or they're just obscure, or nobody plays that class, or everyone thinks it's bad. Right? Really good example would be I think that back in the day when Scourge did 29,000 DPS, it was considered to be kind of trash. Right? Everyone thought it was really bad. Everyone was wrong actually. Scourge was broken at that point. Another good example would be in PvP. Everyone believed Firebrand to be very dominant a while ago in one of the early PvP tournaments, or rather, well, one of the previous kind of community-run PvP tournaments, Massive the Arena. Everyone thought Firebrand was amazing, Tempest not very good, and you'd play Condi Thief. But actually, Rank 55 Dragons, actually, without any changes to the game, said, you know what, actually, Grenade Holosmith, Power Thief, and Tempest, that's the way to go, actually. Yeah, and it completely crushed the meta. And I think that is a really important thing to understand about metagames, is that it can change without the game changing, which I think is why it can actually be a very confusing topic, a very weird topic to talk about, because it's not actually just contingent on the game. It is in a way, but a big part of it is how players interact with the game and what players have learned and what players are actually doing, right? And by the way, quick thing here. No, meta does not stand for most effective tactic available. That is a backronym. In other words, it's an acronym, but people plastered it onto it instead of, making it the other way around, actually. That's not what it means. It often correlates with most effective tactic available, but that's actually not what it means. That's a side effect, not the actual thing itself. Really important to understand that, because I think that this conception that the meta is the best build or the best strategy is actually a misconception that severely causes a lot of confusion in any game community, but definitely Guild Wars too, right? Metagame just means builds that see play, basically, right? That's essentially what it is. But there you go. What do you think, Sneb?
I think it's also...
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Emmy. Ignore Sneb. Sneb doesn't deserve to speak now. That's a joke, by the way.
No, it's okay. I was gonna say, I think a lot of this also kind of comes from, I don't think players really know, like, I guess, to the depth of like Guild Wars 2's combat system, like what is the best in every single encounter, because that's just a lot of information, right? So what people tend to do is then they tend to look at other people and say like, hey, that person did this build and it seemed pretty easy to play. It did a lot of damage. It did all of these stuff. Let me try that out. And if they try it and then if it's effective, then they kind of stick to it. So I think there's like kind of like a social pressure for like, like the meta and stuff. Like the people that are the most influential are those that play like the builds the most often. And I think like a good example of that would be stuff like Snowcrow's, Hardstuck, like, Meta Battle, the people that are writing guides and kind of like publicizing this information, because it's a lot easier to copy someone's build than it is to come up with a build completely by yourself. So that's all I wanted to say.
There you go. Take it away, Snub.
Okay, there's like a lot of levels to this, and I'm probably going to mess it up because I'm kind of thinking out loud a little bit. But to me, meta is usually the most effective thing to do, but it's also the most common in a given circumstance. And it's only the most common because it's either cultural, this is the way it's been done, so this is a tried and true strategy. We know it'll be effective, so we're going to do it that way. Or it's something like, what did I say? It's either the most effective, most common, or we just know it'll work. So I think there's different metas for how you play. For example, there's a pug meta. People know that certain classes are fairly easy to play and effective. They're not necessarily the strongest at that encounter, or they wouldn't speed clear it, or that composition isn't a speed clear, but it's the most tried and true effective method of killing the boss. So this is why in the LFG on raids, you'll see very commonly people will either ask for heal mech or heal firebrand. And it sort of depends on the encounter a little bit, or the wing or whatever. But most people are going to ask for those specific things because they know that in a pickup group setting, those are typically the easiest to play well. And they're what people have seen to be the most effective, as Emmy was alluding to. So there's that, but then there's the speed clear meta. There's the what is the absolute highest DPS possible and what can give us the bare amount of maximum boons while still pumping out the most damage. And that would be a meta. For example, when Catalyst was nerfed, it was nerfed, and this is why people had a big problem with that. It was nerfed because it was the speed clear meta. It was pretty hard to play, but it was pumping a ton of damage and giving the bare minimum boons if you started your whole composition on different rotations with air and whatnot. So people, that was meta, but it was meta in a different way than Mechanist is right now. Mechanist isn't necessarily the highest DPS output, but it is something that is tried and true that people know works and that has a low floor. So people trust that in groups because they think, even if this player isn't necessarily the most experienced, or even if they're not the best at this boss, or even if they're not the best at their class, their baseline damage will be higher than if they played Weaver. So Mechanist is something that people trust because they know that Mechanist can do a lot of damage without a ton of mechanical effort. So to me, meta means a whole bunch of different things all at once. And when we talk about it in a public forum like Reddit or on the actual Guild Wars 2 forums, it gets very confusing because somebody will say, oh, well, there's all these meta slaves. They're forcing me to play Firebrand and they're forcing me to play this and that. And I often want to say, well, meta in what context? Do you mean you're just joining the LFG and people are asking for tried and true builds and you don't want to play a tried and true build and so you're frustrated with that? Or like, what's the deal? What are we actually talking about?
Yeah. I think the multi-layered element of that is super important, actually. And kind of meta in what context? Meta at what? At doing what? Do you want to kill the boss as quick as possible? Do you want to have the highest win rate when it comes to killing the boss? Because this is something that I think it sounds really obvious when you say it, but it's not necessarily obvious. For example, this is my favorite example. QT a while ago, they did something like a four-man Gorseval, right? And obviously, when they upload the video, you see them do it for the first time, right? They do it in one shot because they don't upload all the fails. But in the description, it says, "We tried this 450 times before we got it." Right? And you'll see this in all the record runs, even in, with 10 players in a full raid squad. If you look at these records, like the recent Veil Guardian record, they ran, I think, was it 6 Blade Swords, 2 Firebrands, and 2 Spectres? That is unequivocally the best tactic for killing Veil Guardian in terms of speed. It's the world record now, and it beat what was thought to be an unbeatable record because it was using some kind of broken Scourge mechanics back in the day. But meta in what context? Is that the best in what way? That's the best strategy for killing it really quickly, but probably not the best strategy for killing it first try. It probably took them a lot of tries to do that, actually, right? To get that down there. So I think that's a really interesting nuance, because you might look at that and go, well, hang on, Bladesworn is broken. This build is giving quickness and it's ridiculously high DPS. What the hell, right? But in a pug group, you're probably not going to be running 6 Bladesworns on every single boss, right? That's just not going to be how it's going to be, right? They were using
and Bladesworn isn't easy to play at all, right? Bladesworn is not an easy class to play because it's very much about timing the mechanics of the boss. So while Bladesworn is very, very meta in that particular engagement and probably a few others, in a pickup group setting, if I see a Bladesworn, and I know that this is probably incorrect thinking, but when I see a Bladesworn, I think one of two things. I either think this is a warrior main through and through, and they are very good at this, or I think, this is somebody who's probably trying to experiment a little bit, or just really likes this class, and maybe they don't know what they're doing as much. And it's weird, the discrepancy between a good Bladesworn and a poor, it's very high. Whereas, like I described before, the Mechanist, it's not as high. And so that huge gap in skill level really affects what people perceive to be good.
Yeah, and I think this is a very natural flow into, in my opinion, the most important topic in this conversation, and that's actually the social element. In my opinion, this probably goes for other games as well, maybe to a different degree, I imagine. But certainly in Guild Wars 2, I think the perception of what builds are good or playable or viable, whatever word you want to call it, is vastly skewed towards like a very narrow view, right? I think people go, oh yeah, everything that isn't Firebrand and Mechanist, trash. Maybe not quite to that degree, but I think there is an idea in the Guild Wars 2 community that there's a very small selection of builds that are good and everything else really isn't, right? And if you try and play something outside of the this kind of very tightly defined metagame, you're going to have a difficult time getting into groups and you're going to perform a lot worse even when you do. And I actually think that's totally incorrect. Actually, like totally incorrect, in fact. And I really came to this conclusion actually because I was doing a tier list because you know, I like content, right? I admit it. I like doing tier lists. It amuses me. And I was going through the builds for offensive supports, defensive supports, and damage dealers. And what I noticed was that although there actually are, it's quite lacking in the healer department, actually. There are a lot of builds have like really strong heal builds, but there are a huge amount of offensive supportive builds and damage builds that are actually good. In fact, I think almost every elite specialization in the game, if not every elite specialization in the game, except for maybe one or two outliers that are fairly undertuned, actually has a build that is more than good enough to clear almost all raid and strike content. And I think that is not the perception of the way the game is right now, you know. You know, I want to actually kind of stop talking here and let the gamers kind of leap in on this because I can't because this topic is so fascinating. But I love it. I saw someone posting, I don't know where it was. I think it was on the subreddit, yeah. And they said, and this was upvoted too. It was quite heavily upvoted. It was like 20, 30 upvotes. This was a somewhat popular opinion. I really missed the days of Heart of Thorns when the PvE meta was more balanced and diverse. And that, to me, summed up this entire thing. And I thought, wow, this is actually a crazy comment. Because the exact opposite is true. The metagame in PvE right now, which sounds weird, and it's going to sound weird considering stuff like Mech and Firebrand, is easily the most diverse it's ever been. Seriously, that's actually true. There are more options that are good and will, you know, when you play them well and you understand how they work, can deliver value to your group than ever before. In Heart of Thorns, and you can, there's actually some of this on my YouTube channel. If you go and watch the first elitist raiding party, you will actually see that people played double Chrono, double Warrior, double Druid, quadruple Tempest on every boss in the entire game. That's actually how the game played out. Every single one is what you would play. And this is because Chrono was the only build that could apply quickness and alacrity, or rather, alacrity, right? Warrior was busted, particularly because it was like how you got might back in the day too, like with Phalanx Strength Warrior, and Druid was like the only healer, right? You know, Tempest was actually, yeah, you know, it was all right, but like Druid was actually insane back then. It was like the Omega comp, right? The insane comp that you'd play everywhere. And the fact that it's perceived that way, and this perception seems to be so distorted from the actual game itself, it just fascinates me. And it's why I think that a lot of the issues with the game aren't just to do with the balance. Don't get me wrong, there are obviously clear balance issues. You'd be completely unhinged to deny that. But I really have come over the years, I've been galvanized actually in this opinion as time goes on, that the real core issue with the metagame and the problems that we see arise with play rates being really high and nobody playing this build and everyone playing this build instead, right? I actually think it's very, very heavily influenced, not by the game, but actually by the perception and the kind of culture and social factors around metagame in general. I think that it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Because like I just said, I mean, I don't like that I think that, but in my experience, the skill gap between in certain classes and in certain situations, like Elementalist. I either know that if an Elementalist is on my team, it's going to be like Omega God tier, or they're going to struggle. That's usually what happens. Because if you play Elementalist, you either are just love Elementalist and you're trying out raids and stuff, and maybe maybe there's some gaps there, or you're like speed clear, have played Elemental since day one. You're the one doing the benchmarks, like, and it's weird. It's weird that that's the case, but it feels like Elemental is just harder to play because maybe it's a little bit squishier. It doesn't provide as many boons and things. It doesn't have the same level of support as a Firebrand or a Mechanist. But then I have like a similar situation. It's Mechanist, and there's just like very little difference. Like, yeah, the best players are going to play mech really well, but the skill gap isn't as high. And so I think that is probably the main reason that the community perceives things to suck, is because, well, certain things might be harder to play. So on average, players aren't as good at them. And so you look at the stats and things on like Wingman and whatever. And of course, their damage is going to be lower because they're harder to play, harder to time the rotation around the mechanics, whatever it may be. And that feeds into this perception that things are bad. When they're not bad, they might just be more difficult to execute well. And if they're more difficult to execute well, the perception is that they're not good. And then this just goes in this constant circle of no one playing it. And if no one's playing it, then no one sees it performing well. If no one ever sees it performing well, then people think that it can't perform well. And if people think that it can't perform well, they're never going to even try to play it.
I think you actually touched. Oh, sorry. I thought you
no,
were.
Go ahead. That's it.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Go.
I think what you touched on there at the very end, I think that's, to me personally, is the problem, is that there's not enough people playing these quote unquote off meta classes. Like, I think the big benefit that mech has right now is that there's a lot of people playing it. If you go to Dragon's End, like the top 20 people in terms of DPS are all mechanists. But that being said, you do still see a couple of bars like in there. Like, you see like some Soul Beasts, you see some Virtuosos, you see some Blade Swords, and they're doing just as much damage. And I would actually argue, I don't even think it's necessarily because those players are just really, really good at the game. I think the class has the potential to do that much damage. But because they're not as popular, because there's not as many people playing them, you just don't see it. I would argue as much, like if you had 20 Mechanist players and you had 20 like Soul Beast players, for example, the spread would actually look pretty similar. You would have some players that are just really not understanding how the class functions, and then you'd have some players that really, really understand how the class functions and are able to pull out insane numbers of DPS. But I think a lot of people would probably fall in that middle area where they're doing pretty average, nothing super crazy, but also nothing terrible, and they would be able to perform on the class just fine. I think if there were more people actually playing the class, I think we would see a more even distribution. But I think this kind of goes back to what Teapot was saying, is that the community kind of defines the meta in a way, right? It's like people play what they think is strong. And if people think that Mechanist is strong, then people are going to play it. If people think that Soul Beast is weak, then they're not going to play it. And the people that are actually like, saying that, they're the ones that have the most influence on what I guess the silent majority ends up kind of gravitating to. So yeah, I think another really important thing is that people crave structure, right? It's like in a game such as Guild Wars 2, like you don't have the typical trio, right? You don't have the tank, healer, DPS sort of like structure for people to kind of latch onto. So people will look for that structure from other people. They'll look to other people, see like, hey, that person's playing this thing and it seems to be working well. Hey, these people are saying that this like specific team comp works. I'm going to try that as well. So people will latch on to like a structure that is honestly completely community driven. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great point. I actually think I think I mostly agree with you, but there's one slight nuance to this. When you talked about how if Soul Beast, if there was 20 Soul Beasts, they'd all be the top DPS. I think that's true, but would they be as high of DPS? Soul Beast, for example, really relies on that burst timing and understanding phasing. Like Soul Beast is harder to play than Mechanist. That's the reality. It is. It's not by much, but it is enough. Because if you mess up the Sikkim timing and Suwon switches sides, you've now lost your whole burst, right? And so I think that if more people played Soul Beast, obviously more Soul Beast would be in top of the leaderboard. But I think the reason that more people aren't playing Soul Beast is because people might lack that timing understanding, or just adds another layer of difficulty for them when they're like, why would I play that when I can just play Mechanist and do as much or more damage? And so I really think that that's the reason why we're seeing this advent of the great resurgence of the robot gods is because it's just so easy. You don't have to worry about those burst timings in the same way that you would Soul Beast.
I mean, I guess the way I think of it is, yeah, Mechanist would probably be higher DPS, but is that higher DPS really going to make or break the encounter? I guess I think Su-1 is a bit of a tricky example because that fight has a lot of timings, especially with the dashing back and forth. So I'll use a simpler example, like let's say like Gorseval, right? Like Gorseval is pretty much, for all intents and purposes, a training golem. I think a Mechanist playing on there versus a Soul Beast, and let's say like they're both average, right? Like they're probably primarily auto-attacking. They don't really know the class timings very well. I'd argue like, yeah, Mechanist will probably average higher DPS, but by what margin, right? Like maybe 10, 15%. I don't think that's enough to actually completely like wipe at the encounter. It's kind of like the point that I'm trying to make.
I
think, like,
100% agree with that then. Yeah, it wouldn't matter. You're right.
Yeah. And I think another big thing is like, how do I phrase this? I think it's a player skill thing. I know that comes out to be like super toxic and stuff, but it's like, if you take the time to like even read over the class even minimally, spend like 15 minutes on the golem, you'll probably understand how the different pieces of the build kind of fit together, right? I think that's true for every build. So I guess if the class is really performing so not well to the point where like, you know, you're failing the encounter, I don't think that that's a class problem. I think that's a player problem. So,
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I don't know. I think
that balance,
because I think
right. That's. I mean, ultimately, is that balance? Like, we're talking about the meta and stuff. I don't feel like that's balanced very well. Then.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I see it is that if you're running a DPS class with like a mishmash of like Rabid, Clerics, Marauders, whatever it is, like, you know, I wouldn't even say that's necessarily skill. That's just a fundamental understanding of how the game works, right? I think if every single class, regardless of like, you know, whether it's power focus or condi focus, if every single class had full Berserker's armor with Runes of the Scholar and Sigils of Force and Impact, and then they had a healer to keep them alive, pretty sure every class is capable of clearing like at least the first 4 wings of Heart of Thorns. But I think what a lot of people, I think especially when they say like off meta, is that they're not talking about off meta classes. They're talking about off meta builds within that class. So I think the class itself is actually in a fairly balanced state. So
I think it's a little bit of both. And let me kind of cut in here a little bit and kind of expand what's going on behind this discussion. To me, what we're talking about here is how do we define if a build is good or not? Is it good because it can beat the game? In other words, it's good enough to beat all the content and it can do that comfortably and do that well? Or do we say a build is good relative to other builds? For, you know, again, with the Gorseval example, Gorseval, what does it require per player in terms of DPS? It's like, I don't actually know exactly, but it's like 10k DPS. 15K? Right, so, something like that. It's some kind of number in that, like 10 to 15k, right? Does that mean that every build that does more than 15k DPS is good? Well, probably not, right? Like, I think that the way we define balance is kind of a mixture of both, right? I think that we can say, for example, I would go ahead and say that Power Reaper, yeah, it's a pretty good build. You know what? I think I enjoy playing Power Reaper. Played a little bit of it on Harvest Temple CM. People have used it to beat Harvest Temple CM. It's a fun build. But would I say that Power Reaper is underpowered? Yeah, I would. I would also say that at the same time, in that same package, right? And then I'd look at something like Power Mech and go, yeah, okay, Power Mech is significantly, you know, it's definitely a better build than Reaper, right? It's pretty overtuned, right? But both of those builds are easily enough to crush raid content. And I think this is where the nuance becomes incredibly important, because people will hear Power Mech is ridiculously overpowered and way better than Power Reaper, and then that will get interpreted as Power Reaper isn't good enough to beat the content, right? And I think here's where that definition slides a bit with the meta, and people using different definitions and speaking in different contexts really becomes problematic, because someone will ask the question, is Reaper good, right? And what they'll be asking is Reaper good enough to beat the game? You know, can I do fractals on my Reaper? Can I do raids on my Reaper? Can I do strikes on my Reaper? right? And then the community will reply with no, right? But they'll be speaking in the context of, is Reaper good relative to other specs? So you have that contextual shift. I think a player asking the question will be asking relative to the game, and the community will answer relative to the other builds. And that won't be communicated. The conversation goes, is Reaper good? People say no, right? But what's actually going on there is someone is asking, is Reaper good enough to clear all of the content? And then people will reply and say, no, Reaper is underpowered right now relative to the other builds. But they'll only say the no and not the context. And of course, the person asking will just ask the question. I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but actually this is, in my opinion, an incredibly complicated topic, which is why it has to be a little bit complicated. That is kind of the issue that I think you really run into with meta. People assume that anything that isn't meta is bad, right? And essentially unplayable. And I think that really skews the perception. And now you have people saying that, oh yeah, Reaper is terrible, you know? Like Reaper is awful, needs to be buffed. And then you have this super weird juxtaposition where people are saying that Reaper and Tempest are unplayable, but then we also have Quantify clearing Harvest Temple CM with Tempest, and we have Subli also clearing Harvest Temple with Reaper, right? These two things don't gel, and it's because there's that lack of nuance in the conversation. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So there's something you said there that that just made me think about. Okay, back to what Emmy and I were talking about. That 10%. If we say, well, Power Reaper is good, or we say, well, you know what, Soul Beast is really good. It actually can do more damage than, you know, the Mechanist. Like, oh, well, that's great. But the problem is that if everything can be cleared without that 10% damage, is it worth it to extend the extra effort in learning that build, in learning the timings, and doing all of those things when you can do 10% less damage and kill everything without expending any effort, really, to learn the rotation? And I would argue that it's not worth it. Like, why bother learning the burst timing of a Soul Beast when you'll get a little bit more damage than Mechanist, if literally everything in the game can be solved with something that is really low effort? And I think that's the issue in the meta that's really problematic, is that it's not even about what's the best at an encounter. It's what can kill the encounter with the least amount of effort possible. It feels like that's what the meta has become a lot of the time. And that's why you see certain classes just blowing up on the play scale.
There's a weird thing there that I want to dig into here. When, in my opinion, if you go down that road, the entire conversation becomes somewhat pointless. Because if we're going to say, okay, I'm always going to play what's the lowest effort for the most reward, then, in my opinion, there's nothing to complain about anymore, because that's always going to be one build, right? There is always going to be, this is the Busto build. And it's okay to play that way. I'm not saying that that's wrong, right? Honestly, you can play the game however you want. You want to play like only the worst build or only the best build? Hell, you know, knock yourself out, right? It's entirely up to you. But there's only ever going to be one solution or one answer to that question. No matter whatever the way the game is, there's always going to be the build that's the best. The build that is the most efficient, that's going to give you the best results. So I find it really weird when the conversation takes this turn, because at that point, in my opinion, you can't complain about anything, right? Because it's just like, well, if we only care about what's the best, well, there's only going to be one answer to that ever, right? So at that point, the conversation stops.
Yeah, and I think people... How do I explain this? I think you're right. I think that's what people don't like, though. They don't like that the
there
class that they play.
Yeah.
They don't like that there is an answer, and they don't like that their class. Like if you play Elementalist, yo, I just gotta say, it feels really bad that to get to the same level as Mechanist, you basically have to get like a master's degree in Elementalist. Like you have to practice so much.
Pushback.
It's
time.
way harder.
Pushback time. Actually, there is a really easy Scepter Elementalist build right now that does 38k DPS. It's on Fennec's YouTube channel. The Catalyst rotation is actually pretty darn easy. It's not as easy as Mechanist, but actually I've got to hit pushback on this, in my opinion, because this is part of the perception. I think people exaggerate the difficulty of stuff a lot, right?
Well, yeah, that was hyperbole.
Yeah, I know, but I want to be clear because a lot of people actually propagate this and they think it's not hyperbole, right? So yeah, but yeah, again, seriously, there is a 38k DPS Scepter Ellie build that is like very easy to play, right? And there's, honestly, Fennec, what a giga Chad, even made a simplified rotation where you literally just camp fire and earth, right? And it does 37k DPS, right? And that's ranged too, not your melee build. That's actually ranged, to be clear, right? These builds do exist, and it's not as hard as people think. But yeah, I do agree with you that obviously, yeah, like there are some builds that kind of like, oh, I'm playing my heart out, and the mech is, I'm losing to a mech, right? But yeah, sorry, continue.
Yeah, I don't know. I just find, look, I'm an NG main. I've been an NG main since day one. Mech came out. I used to play Hollow and Scrapper, and I'm like, holy crap, there's no way I'll ever play those two things versus Mechanist again now. Because Mechanist is just so much easier to play with like similar utility, right? And then I think, okay, well, I used to play Tempest. I used to play Heal Tempest all the time. Well, then they changed it from 10-person to 5-person, and there's some other changes, and then Heal Mech came out. I'm like, holy crap! Like I'll never play Tempest again, even though I really like it, because it's just Mechanist is just so much stronger that I can have such an impact on my team. You know, and remember, I'm saying this is a little hyper. Never play it again, right? But what I'm trying to illustrate here is if your concern is about winning and/or about doing the best for your team and providing the most value and giving them the best shot at winning, when you look at these sort of lower effort builds, it's not, there's no argument, right? It feels really bad to think, okay, well, I can go and have a similar impact if I practice really hard and know everything really well. But if I can't put in that effort, or I can't expend the time, like I just can't spend the time learning how to play Tempest at a really high level, then you're always going to be underachieving relative to some of these easier to play builds. And I think that's the issue that a lot of people have, is they think, well, I love this and I want to play it, but the problem is that I don't actually have time to get as good at this. And so this person next to me who's probably put very little time into it, they're going to be so much stronger than me. And I want to be strong for my team. You know, I want to achieve things and help them and do the best that I can. And I don't know, I feel like people probably feel that way, you know?
I think a big part of this is that Mechanist, let's just say like default, Mechanist is probably the easiest class that you can play for the most reward right now. I think it's a problem with the second place, right? Like what is the current second place to that one? And what is the margin between, I guess, like the first place and the second place? And I would argue like, second place is probably either Virtuoso or Firebrand, right? And I think with both of those classes, Firebrand a little bit less, but you do have to learn at least 15 new skills, right? By reading through the 3 different tones. And Virtuoso, you kind of have to time like your cooldown resets and stuff. It is a pretty significant jump in effort, but you can get to the same amount of like damage or utility or whatever you're measuring it by. And then I think like if we look past second and third place, then like even farther down the list, there are other classes that are obviously, just as effective, but they do take even more effort. I think when we're talking about specifically the meta for like, low reward or low risk, high reward, like, especially in pug settings, it's about evening that scale. But I guess like a thing that I kind of want to point out is that we're talking only about pug situations, which will always naturally gravitate towards that type of style. But what about specific like encounters, right? Like I've definitely seen like in specific encounters, let's say like Harvest Temple CM, for example, right? There are some builds where if played well, really, really, really excel there. And especially in an encounter where it's really difficult to clear it. So only a few people in the entire community can even attempt to reach that goal. Like their meta is completely different. Right. So it's like, I guess I feel like the conversation is revolving around Mechanist a little bit too much and we're kind of beating a dead horse. But like, what about the meta in those types of encounters instead? Right. Like I would argue like Bladesworn is incredible DPS on Harvest Temple if you know how to play it well. I've seen like a couple people on NA like completely destroy Mechanists in terms of damage. And then there's also like the meta of like, the healers or like the support classes, right? Like on Harvest Temple, you have virtuosos that are placing portals. Like why virtuosos instead of thieves with like shadow step and then place shadow portal or something like that? Like, what about the meta in those situations?
Yeah, I actually think that's problematic too. I could be incorrect about this, by the way, but my understanding is the reason that we don't see Spectre is because Venoms don't work.
Yeah.
I don't know if and that's problematic. If Venoms worked, I think actually people would play more Thief stuff.
Yeah, I guess it's just.
I think it's a slight tangent here, but I actually think it's because healers. I think there aren't enough really, really strong healers. And the conversation takes around mech and the pug meta, because in my opinion, it is the most important conversation to have. I think at high level, people there's always going to be a very extreme meta game at high level, because when you want to play things really, really well and do the best you can, you aren't going to leave like a free 3% extra damage or 3% efficiency on the table. That's just not the way you're likely to engage, right? Like if you're doing a speed run, if you're doing a really hard boss, you aren't going to say, oh, I'm just going to arbitrarily make my composition slightly worse to reduce my win rate and make it take like another 5 hours to progress, right? That's just not going to happen. You're always going to go for the absolute best that you can, and you can expect players to actually play their build a lot better, right? I think Mechanist is such a problem because it's not just like a little bit easier than every other build in the game. It's like way easier than every other build in the game. That's why it has such a distorting effect. If Mechanist was a fair bit harder to play, I don't think people would actually care about it, obviously, right? Because that's like its defining characteristic. But yeah, that's why it causes such a huge issue. But yeah, before I derail the conversation again, please continue down this thread, because I'm reading the chat and I don't know, I'm about to activate here. You know, like things are being said. I've got to talk about some stuff, but I want to continue this thread first. Please continue, my friends.
I guess the main thing that I'm thinking of is like, let's compare Harvest Temple to Kaineng, right? Or Kaineng over. Like let's not even like look at the CMs and like let's just talk about normal, right? Like I would argue Virtuoso on Kaineng is probably significantly stronger, does significantly more damage, offers significantly more utility than Mechanist does, right? But the converse can kind of be said for like Harvest Temple. Like, you know, Mechanist provides a lot of range, pretty much an instant shadow step with almost sacrificing no DPS at all. You're able to like, you know, range from a DPS, so you can provide boons from it, from a range, all of that kind of stuff. So I guess it's just like the meta is fluid, right? It changes based off of the encounter. It changes based off of the current balance of the game, and it also changes basis off of like the perception that players have with that specific class. So I think fixating so much on mech, obviously it is a problematic spec, but I think there is a lot more that other classes can bring to the table as well. And I would argue to the point where they are more meta in certain situations.
Yeah, I think you're hitting a really good point here. One thing I've thought a lot about is if they're going to create more encounters like Harvest Temple where mobility is important, then do we say that every class should have access to more mobility, i.e. portals? Because there are only a few things that can teleport and only a few things that have portals. And when that's the case, those classes will always be better at Harvest Temple because they can get out of sticky situations, they can make up for mechanics, whatever, right? Like when you play DPS power mech, you can teleport into a green if you need to back something up. Or the Virtuosos have the portals. Portals are massive. They have blink, massive. I don't know. If you don't have that, then you're limited in what you can do there. And it's sort of requisite, at least for the current strategies available, it's pretty requisite that you have those. Do you think that we should have more mobility? That should be spread out? Or does it matter? Is it okay that some things are meta on certain encounters and then maybe not that good in other places? Or
so in my opinion, stuff like this is super interesting, but in my opinion, it's actually you only really see it become super interesting in a very small amount of groups. Like kind of class-specific utility being really good on certain encounters. I do actually approve of that kind of stuff. I think it can, if you go too far with it, it can get a little bit silly. For example, I think you could actually criticize Harvest Temple CM for being so much easier with Portal. Right? Can you do it without Portal? Yeah, you can. You definitely can. I'm not saying it's impossible without that. But Portal is so good on that fight that you are going to have a harder time unless you take Mesmers and use Portal in some way. That is just how the encounter is set up. But I want to kind of pull back here a little bit and explain why I think that this is a really interesting conversation, but I think it's not actually super relevant to the metagame. And I'll do that by telling the story of Tempest. And pre-EOD, I mean like a late Path of Fire Tempest. So kind of late into Path of Fire, Tempest got buffed massively. Specifically, all of the shouts were made 10 target baseline. So it could apply all the boons, and overloads were made 10 target as well. A lot of its boon share abilities were 10 target and so on. This actually made it almost strictly better than Druid on every encounter in the game, actually. But it had one problem. It can't push on Desmina, and it can't do Immobilize quite as well. And those two things utterly destroyed it, right? It meant that almost nobody played Tempest. In fact, most players thought Tempest was terrible, actually. Even though it was almost objectively better on every encounter outside of a few. It had a zillion more healing, way more healing, much better boon application, better recovery potential, really cool utility baked into it. But it didn't see play. And it's because the way the way classes work is that, you know, you tend to be quite sticky, right? You know, you're going to play one build a lot of the time. You don't want to play loads of different builds on different encounters because that's quite expensive for a lot of players to continuously gear up all these different characters and maintain them and learn them. It's time expensive and gold intensive as well. So absolutely, I think you're right. I think, you know, Virtuoso is awesome in some places. Mirage is amazing on certain encounters, right? But here's the thing. Mech is like 90% of the way there everywhere, right? And as a result of that, people aren't going to go and say, oh yeah, but this is really cool 10% of the time. They're going to go, this is amazing all the time, and it's nearly as good as that other thing, right? Or more or less as good as that other thing that's a little bit better. And I can just have one build and play it, right? And I think that's where you see that happen. And, you know, again, you don't take my word for it. I actually had a chat with Subi, one of the members of QT, about Tempest back then. And yeah, like he also said, yeah, most groups, or almost all groups, would have a higher win rate if they were playing Tempest. It was genuinely a broken build. Actually, insane build. Crazy build, actually, with Tempest.
I'm sorry, I want to interject here because this goes back to what Emmy was saying earlier about, you know, if we don't see certain people playing it, or if lots of people aren't playing something, then it's just this ripple effect. Like if you don't see people playing it, they're not going to play it. If you see all your favorite streamers and all the YouTubers are all playing Firebrand all the time, you're going to think the Firebrand's pretty good. You're just making Firebrand. So back when Tempest was good, like you're talking about, when there was, it's still good now, by the way, but when it was like broken and it, you know, 10-person rebound and boons and huge healing application, wash the pain away, Condi cleanse and healing for 10 people. When that was the case, I started playing Minstrel Tempest in every group I ran because I could do all the healing and provide all the boons, except for obviously like Alacrity, Quickness for my entire team. And then I started tanking every encounter with Tempest. And people would give me such crap, right? Like I'd go into a pickup group and people would be like, dude, you got to play Druid. And I'm like, nope, not doing that. Gonna play that. Like I got kicked before because they did not want Tempest, which more power to them. That's their prerogative, right? But people just didn't realize how good it really was because they'd never seen it be good. They had no social proof. If they have no evidence that this is good anywhere because they never see anyone playing it, no one's ever doing anything with it, then to them, it's just not good. There's just no evidence. They can't understand why it would be good if they've never been exposed to it. And yeah, like it was so good. It was so powerful.
Yeah. Let it be known that I've been doing my part and I've been shilling Mesmer every single time that I stream. So I have a pretty big following of people that have started to play Mesmer. So doing my part.
There it is.
I think I guess one of the questions I have, because I was reading some of the comments and stuff, is would you guys say that you would rather have more classes at the level of mech, or would you rather mech not exist at all? I think that's a pretty big question, because I would argue people would actually be very upset if there was not a class like mech in the game, where it's low effort, you can kind of clear all of the content without really needing to spend that much time on it. Because, I mean, people probably know this, but Guild Wars 2 is a game that has a pretty significant older population, right? Because it has no subscription fee, all of the content is horizontal, so there's not a pressure where you need to spend like 10 hours every single day grinding, that sort of thing. I think a lot of people would actually be really upset if a low effort build like mech didn't exist. So I guess the question is, if we want more classes to be at the level of mech, where it's very effective in terms of damage, very effective in terms of utility, pretty easy to play, where you don't have to worry too much about like boss timings, phase timings, whatever it is, with significant amount of mobility, I guess the question is, how would that affect the game in the long term? Because I think that's what a lot of people actually want, is they don't want mech to disappear. They want more classes to be at the level of mech. But then that kind of brings in the questions of like, power creep, right? It's like kind of making old content kind of insignificant, right? And then there's also the question of like, how that affects, I guess, like the in-game economy, or like how they're going to balance like future like encounters, like that sort of thing. I think, yeah, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the times players are pretty good at identifying like, what feels good and what doesn't feel good, but they're all very short-term feelings, right? Like, what about the long-term effects of these, I guess, like desires on the game?
Hot take.
See, the thing is, it's a really good question. I actually think there are a lot of things that are similar to mech. We've seen a lot of low intensity builds the last few months, right? So there actually are a lot of things. They just don't have the spotlight that mech has right now. Maybe mech is just one notch above those, but there are lots of things that can do very well with very little effort. I would argue that Mirage, specifically staff Mirage, there's a low intensity build for that. You can do a lot of damage, but it also provides a heck of a lot of boons for everybody around you.
Actually true.
So it's maybe a little bit selfless, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. And so you might not see as big of numbers yourself, but you're providing so much value to your squad, or in open world, the people around you. I mean, that's a big deal. So I'll say what I think. I wish that everything wouldn't become so simple that it trivializes a lot of content, because personally, and this is very much a personal viewpoint, personally, I feel like if everything is very, very easy to play, then there's never any fail state, and it just kind of feels odd, right? Big scary dragon, but not actually scary, because everyone's going to absolutely demolish you every single time. I find that just a little strange. That said, I actually think the direction that ArenaNet would probably like to go is to make more things easier to play. And I think we're seeing a transition towards that with the recent buffs to just general power coefficients on a lot of weapons. I think they want it so that people, when they go in and they're starting to play Elementalist or NG or whatever, that they have some sort of instant satisfaction in playing that, and it feels like they're doing a lot better right off the bat. So what I'm saying is, I think they want to lower the floor on a lot of things. My hope is that doesn't completely trivialize and power creep the crap out of everything, though.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, kind of when I was asking that question, I already knew where I kind of fell on that as well, and I completely agree. I think there are a lot of classes that are pretty competitive with Mechanist right now. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I do think the hyperfixation on Mechanist is, in a way, is kind of misdirected. I think it's just because a lot of people look at this class and they think, oh, just auto-attacking and pressing your mech skills, that's like, what, 4 buttons? Or something like that, and you can pretty much clear every encounter in the game. I would actually argue, I think there's a lot of classes like that, where if you just press 4 buttons, you're gonna hit a pretty significant chunk of damage without really needing to focus that much on your DPS. But what a lot of people don't realize is that all of those builds follow the same formula, right? Like they have all of one type of stat set, right? Like Berserkers, Vipers, whatever, like Ritualists, if you're doing like hybrid supports, they all have 6 of the same type of rune, and then they have sigils on their weapons that like give them certain benefits. And I don't know. I guess I just feel like a lot of the times when we think of low intensity, we think of these builds as like something being super, super revolutionary, all of that kind of stuff, when in reality, it's just demonstrating a basic understanding of how the game functions. And I think if that knowledge were there, I don't think we would be fixating on mech quite as much. So.
I 100% agree, because I mean, this is such a big conversation with meta, non-meta, and whatever. Look, I actually wouldn't give a crap what people play if they could play it well, because the differential between someone playing Mechanist well and somebody playing Power Reaper well is so low that it doesn't really matter that much. Maybe on some specific encounters, there's some pros and cons, but otherwise, it's completely negligible on 99% of content. I wouldn't care. The problem is that generally speaking, I think players struggle with some of the core, more foundational aspects of combat, and that makes certain classes better than others, purely because if you don't have the knowledge, it's not as punishing to you. Like Power Mechanist. I view Power Mechanist as an extremely friendly to play class, because you don't really need a lot of mechanical knowledge. You don't really need a lot of encounter knowledge to perform well. And there are a few other, builds and things that are probably similar, but ultimately, I think we find ourselves in this hole of the meta because it sounds really bad to say this, but I think generally Guild Wars 2 is just a complex game for a lot of players, and there's a lot of hidden things. You don't necessarily know your impact. You can't go around and be like, players just suck, because that's not really true. I mean, sure, there's players that maybe aren't as skilled as other players, but really what it is some players just don't have any concept of how they're performing at any given time, and they're only given the feedback of positivity through getting a gold medal in the meta events and killing different bosses and things. So they just don't know, right? You can't be super mad at them for that.
I think there is one thing that's been missed here that's super important, and it's that mech actually is overpowered.
I do think it's very strong.
This is the thing. No, I'll go further. It is overpowered. Like Mechanist,
it can do too much at the same time as doing damage with little effort.
The issue, I don't actually care about the little effort. I actually don't think effort is super relevant in terms of balance, to be honest. That's going to be a hot take, and maybe that's a debate for another time.
I would disagree with that.
I actually think that if you do that, all you're saying is the hard builds are going to be broken, broken overpowered, because we're trying to balance them for the entirety of the game. I just don't think that's good game design, to be honest. I think things should be... and in general, bonus meme here, complexity is its own reward. The more abilities you have, the more answers you have, the more reactive and responsive you can be in general. That's a summary on that. But that would take like 5 hours to actually debate. But
I'm going to debate it just for a second, but that's not necessarily true for all things. Because I mean, Elementalist has a lot of different skills, but the skills don't really do that much, right? There's a lot of the skills don't have boons, and a lot of the skills don't have a lot of utility or a lot of CC. You look at Mechanist,
because
Elementalist has all of that, right?
But Elementalist is underpowered.
Yes.
but that's not...
I guess I agree.
Yeah, Elementalist is underpowered. But that's not because it's complicated, it's because it's underpowered.
I wonder if ArenaNet literally just took like a nerf hammer to some of the numbers on mech, right? And then like took a buff hammer to some of the numbers on Ellie. I think already people would be a lot happier, because I think it's not just the actual effectiveness of the class. I think it's the perceived effectiveness of the class. And I've seen this happen a lot with games that are super, super reliant on balance. A class will get a pretty minor nerf, right? Like maybe like a 5% decrease on a specific skills like damage or healing output or something like that. And then everyone will like lose their minds. They're like, oh my gosh, they're like gutting this class. This class is unplayable now, something. I think actually a lot of people might even benefit, like, if they said, yeah, we're just going to nerf mech's auto attacks by 5%. I think in the grand scheme of things, the DPS uptime, the effort, the utility, all of that stuff would be pretty much unchanged. But I think it would make people then become more wary of that class. And then I think kind of like the similar thing would happen if they said like, okay, for Elementalists, we're just going to flat buff every single DPS skill on that class by 0.5%. I think immediately people would become more receptive to it. Yeah. And I think that's, go ahead.
I just really want to take it back to this thing about mech, because I want to answer the question, would you delete mech? I wouldn't. This is where, no, absolutely not. Definitely not. I actually don't have a problem with Mechanist existing. I actually kind of like it. I kind of like that there's an easy build. that people can play and just blast away. Like, I like the low intensity stuff, for example. The issue to me isn't that mech exists, it's that mech is overpowered. If Mechanist did 32k DPS, not 37, honestly, I think it will be fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But Teapot, didn't you say that easy builds can perform really well? Yeah, because people have... I'll see your hyperfixation about mech, and I'll raise you the actual relevant... Well, the other... Not the actual relevant. The other relevant hyperfixation, which is the hyperfixation on damage output in Guild Wars 2. Mech is not overpowered because it does 37k DPS. That's actually not an issue. Mech is overpowered because it does 37k DPS, is ranged the entire time, 1/3 of its damage is from an AI that's totally passive and it just doesn't care about mechanics in any way whatsoever. It has a stun break and like Condi cleanse 1200 range blink on a 20-second fucking cooldown. It has loads of CC baked into it. It has loads of self-healing attached to it as well, so it's insanely tanky. It's a medium armor class, medium HP class, so it has really good durability, and it has loads of utility that it can take very easily. That is why mech is overpowered. It's not because it does 37k DPS. It's because it does 37k DPS and all of those other things combined. If you chip away at that damage or increase the cooldowns on Shift Signet, right, or whatever, and some of these other really strong things that it has, and you reduce the amount of crowd control it has, you reduce this, you reduce that, right, then all of a sudden you're in business. But I don't think you can do that. You don't need to do that, right? I think it's totally fine. Just slash the damage down. It's a relatively low damage build with a bunch of really great utility. You love to see it. We're having a good time. Hell yeah, right? No problemo, right? I don't really mind which way they do it. I prefer to let builds have more utility. I think it's more fun in general, rather than kind of like, leaving them have high DPS and be glass cannons. Personally, I don't like glass cannon builds. They feel kind of boring to me. So I like flexible builds. So I just like nerf the damage down, and then mech isn't an issue. Because again, I think the entire conversation around meta always revolves around damage, when I think that's actually a huge red herring. Because damage is only a tiny part of that story. Like the fact that mech can do 37k DPS at 1200 range, alarm bells should be ringing right now. That's even more range than Scourge. And bear in mind, Scourge was actually overpowered at around 30k DPS at 900 range. Okay, so what about 37 at 1200 range? That's a big problem, right? That's where your issues are really coming into play, right? With this stuff. So I wouldn't remove mech because, I see a lot of people were talking in the chat saying that, people don't like that an easy build does a lot of damage. So two things there. One, no one on this panel, hates easy builds at all. That's definitely not the case. In fact, hell, we've even done a competition just about making builds that are a little bit more accessible and a little bit easier to play. So definitely not. Two, I actually agree. If people don't like it just because it's easy, that's a shit reason to not like it. Three, I just told you the actual good reason for thinking the mech is problematic. It's because of the actual mechanics of the build, not just the damage. Okay, there it is. I've been holding that in for a long time of Unchained. Okay, there it is. But that's how it is.
I completely agree. I want to tack on to that. I think the reason why there's such a big fixation on DPS is because of Arc DPS. And I think let me add a disclaimer here. I 100% think that Arc DPS is a good resource for the community because it allows you to actually measure your performance over long periods of time. But I think a big problem is that DPS is one of the few things that's actually measurable consistently, right? It's like if you want to measure a class's break bar, like damage output, you have to go to an encounter that specifically has a lot of break bar emphasis, right? If you want a class to see how good it is at healing or something like that, you need to go to a very heal intensive fight. If you want to measure how good a class is at mobility, then you need to go to an encounter that really, really emphasizes mobility. It's not constant, right? Like you need significantly less mobility on Gorseval than you do on, let's say, Largos or something like that, right? So I think a big reason why the community fixates on DPS is because it is the one constant across every single encounter in the game. And I would argue not even just in PvE, but also in Wolver's World and PvP. So I think that to me is why I think DPS is kind of like the standard by which we measure things, which is why I was also mentioning earlier, I think if you literally just took a 0.05% nerf to mech's numbers, just across the board, people would instantly start thinking, oh no, mech is going to get nerfed. It's not going to be as good anymore, whatever it is. And that's more of the perception, right? It's you're not nerfing the class itself. You're nerfing the perception that this class is overpowered. And then I think that would allow more breathing room for other classes that also provide a lot of utility, also have a lot of mobility, also are able to like, provide healing, support boons, all of that kind of stuff to also kind of fill in the gaps that would leave. So, yeah.
Oh,
I think you're mostly right. However, what I would add is that I think people fixate on DPS because and I think you kind of said this, but it's just so easy to understand relative to boons and things.
Agreed.
I think that people, sounds harsh, but I honestly think that people can, if you say, hey, your damage is low, or you say, hey, your damage is high, that's really easy to understand. If you say, hey, did you know your damage would be higher if you had might, quickness, and alacrity, and only these things are the things that can provide it, and you need to gear this and do this and use these stats and do these things so that it'll have it, and subgroups, and suddenly people have zoned out and they're actually already playing Final Fantasy. Like it's just harder for people to it's harder for people to understand what all of that means and the impact that it has. If more people really understood how impactful boons were, I think way more people would play boon stuff in open world. Like I exclusively play boon DPS stuff in open world. I play alacrity everywhere because I almost never have alacrity. And I know that it has a big impact. But I think most people don't understand that, and or they might play a little bit more selfish, which is perfectly valid if that's how you're going to play an open world. I would also argue that when it comes to healing is inconsequential, except for instanced content. And most players don't play instanced content. Most players play open world content, where healing is almost irrelevant. And people can argue that with me all they want, but it's true. Healing matters very little in open world because the consequence of you getting defeated is you just waypoint and you come back. Or if you go down, people can just res you, and that's fine. And most things aren't incredibly threatening in open world. So, well, it's probably important to talk about healing and whatever. Most people probably don't care that much about it, and they don't need to know the numbers because it just doesn't matter in the content that most players would do. So when you take that into account, you take the misunderstanding of boons and perhaps not understanding how consequential and how impactful they are, that's when you have a really big problem, because now people are only fixating on DPS because they think it's the only thing that matters.
Yeah. That definitely screws up the metagame a lot. Like, because look, yeah, I'll let Emmy go here, but let me just say this. Let me just underline what Sneb said here, and let me underline a big truth about Guild Wars 2 here. Utility outweighs damage significantly, actually, when it comes down to how effective and how much of an influence you can have. And that's why a lot of the builds that do really well are the more hybrid-y, more flexible builds that can handle a lot of scenarios. That is the reality. And actually, one quick example, let's do interactive segment on TeaTime here, because this is going to be an interesting one here. Now, actually, this might not work super well because you guys might have watched my tier list yesterday, but chat, how, Power disagree? No, you'd be wrong, actually. I just went over why Power Mech has excellent utility, by the way, but never mind. Here's an example. How good do you guys think Power Scrapper is? Like, do you guys think Power Scrapper is a good build or a bad build? Like, what are we looking at? Like, out of 10, what do we think?
Not quickness? Just DPS.
Pure DPS Scrapper, right? I just want to see what the chat thinks. Okay.
Okay, I have opinions on this, but I'll wait for the chat.
Yeah. Also, actually, while they're doing this, I saw someone ask if there's a place for healers in endgame content. I think, yes, there is, specifically with instance content. Like, it would be very, very difficult to clear most encounters without at least one healer. But what they're talking about specifically right now is in context of the entirety of PvE, both open world and instance. So.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Healer's not super relevant in open world. In fact, I would argue if you're playing healing in open world, that though your heart is in the right place, it's not very effective for your team. It's much better to play an offensive boon support build where you're dealing a lot of damage, but also providing those necessary boons, because the healing doesn't really matter, the healing piece. So if you're statting for healing power, it's kind of a waste. That's what I'm getting at. But in instance content, very valuable.
Yeah. Hybrids are good in open world. So, you know, a lot of people are saying 7 out of 10, and that's part. I think I kind of loaded the question in a bad way, actually, which was probably skewed this a little bit. But Now you look. Well, we'll kind of move on from this, but I would say that most people probably perceive that build to be very bad, actually, and a very weak build. You very rarely see power DPS scrappers in instance content. That build's actually really good, though. It actually is really strong. I would give it a very high rating. I gave it A tier, actually, in my tier list. It's very strong, actually, much better than people think it is. And a big part of that is because people fixate on the damage number. It does around like 35k DPS or something like that. It's a solid number, but the other stuff that it does makes it really, really good, right? Like this is the important thing to think about, right? It's actually very good. But yeah, the quickness build is also very good as well. It's very high value. But yeah, just like slight tangent aside, what I was trying to get at there is that DPS really does skew it a lot, and it causes people to completely discard or view certain builds as like complete trash because they don't do very much damage or not as much damage as the other options there as well. But yeah, there you go. But there you go. You say rate on damage? I don't rate on damage, actually. It's obviously a part of it, but the reason why it has such a high rating is because of its utility. But anyway, Emmy, go.
Okay, yeah, Evie, go.
No, I've already said my part. Though I guess one thing I did want to mention is we talk about utility, but I think not all utility is kind of created equal, right? Like if you have Aegis and stability, that kind of utility really goes a lot farther than utility like Vigor or what's like another kind of like whatever one, like even like Fury now, because like pretty much every class is able to keep up like 50% Fury. So it's like, I think also judging off of utility is kind of a trap as well, and it's also really hard to have a discussion around because it's just not as easily measurable. Like super speed is like nice in some encounters. Like I would argue, like in World vs. World, super speed is pretty much mandatory if you want to do those large scale fights. But super speed in like SH, where you might accidentally eat off the side, is probably a lot less valuable.
Yeah. I actually think I can add to that in saying, I'll give my opinion as to why, because I think you're absolutely correct. Super speed is very valuable, actually, on certain encounters, but the problem is that it takes action to make it valuable. Whereas, in my opinion, stability and Aegis, the value is that
existing.
It just exists. Yeah, you don't have to do anything, right? You're applying that boon is enough. But me applying super speed is not enough to save you. You have to move. So that creates some problems, right? So you're like, yeah, super speed really good, but it doesn't really matter if the people that have super speed don't do anything with it. And I would argue that's the case with a lot of just like Vigor. Vigor is incredible.
It's very
right?
good,
like,
yeah.
It's very
so
good, especially on Mirage.
But you have to dodge.
Yeah. Yeah, but here's the problem. You have to press the dodge button. And if people aren't pressing the dodge button, Vigor has no value. It doesn't do anything. So yeah, it's kind of interesting because that actually really defines the meta. Those boons that gain so much value in the inactivity of the people that have them are just so much more powerful than boons that require action to see value. And that's why you see so many people fixating on the things that have stability and Aegis, i.e. Firebrand and Mechanist and all of those things. And it's probably why we're seeing some other classes gain access to those things. Like, doesn't White Tiger now give Aegis? So if you're a Ranger, you could do that. Or now they're adding stability to a few things. They're kind of forced to do that or completely rework the boon, you know? And that's a thing. That's interesting, right? It's tough. I'm a big enjoyer of Scrapper and Super Speed, but people always tell me that it's worthless. And unfortunately, if you add context to that, it's worthless if other people won't use it. And that's accurate, and that people don't use it. But if you will use it, for example, on Doom, when you're getting pulled into the center, Super Speed basically negates that. And so Scrapper is actually really good there, because during the pre-events, Scrapper does extra damage because power damage to the skeletons and stuff. And then you also, can save yourself from a few mechanics. But if people won't move, it doesn't matter. Like if they won't move, it doesn't matter. So it kind of sucks. Whenever the meta conversation comes up, there's so many opinions. The one that I actually find the most frustrating is you should play with me even if I don't play the meta. Ooh. And the problem with that is I want to say, well, yeah, I shouldn't be a jerk to you. But at the same time, if I'm the commander of a group, I'm setting the parameters. And it's funny because this actually it just swings wildly the other direction too. You know how I've done challenges like 10 core Guardian or all core Guardian Dragon's End and stuff? People got extremely upset with me a few times because they would join my group on the LFG for Dragon's End that said all core Guardian Dragon's End, all core Guardian only. It literally said that. They would join on an engineer and I would whisper them and I would say, you need to come on a core Guardian because that's like what we're doing. We're doing like a YouTube video. It's going to be kind of fun and whatever. And they just wouldn't reply. And I'd wait a while. And then I'd kick them from the group. And then I'd get a message back like, WTF, man, why did you kick me from the group? I'm like, well, because you're not playing core Guardian. And well, I shouldn't have to play core Guardian. Like, well, you don't, but that's what our group's doing. And it's exactly the same thing with the meta stuff. Sometimes I'll run a raid group where I'm like, I want to be as efficient as possible, or I just want guaranteed kills. These are the roles that I'm looking for. I want a heal brand. So let's say I'm doing Soulless Horror. I want 2 heal brands with mace if they can, because it's just really powerful there. A druid to push for even extra safety and healing. And then a bunch of Condi, ideally some Scourges to epi the TD, and that's it. Can you do it in other ways? Absolutely. Am I just picking a strategy that I want to go with and executing on it? Yes. I don't believe it's necessarily evil to go out there and pick a strategy that you want to do and build your squad around that. I don't feel like that's evil. What would be evil if somebody who's not wanting to conform to that joins and you flame them out? You can have somebody join and say, hey, we're actually doing this strategy. This is what we're looking for. So unfortunately, it's not going to work. I feel like that's the polite thing to do. But I just can't understand. It feels so entitled to have people that say, you're the commander. I want to join your group and play how I want. And I just don't get it. Like, I don't do that to other commanders. I don't go in and be like, you must let me play for Ellie. You must. It just doesn't make sense. I think it's okay for people to set requirements or to engage in specific strategies, meta, non-meta, whatever. I don't think it's okay to bully people or be impolite or whatever. But I just can't comprehend why you would go out there and just attack people for wanting to play a certain way.
Okay. Before we let Nike unleash, I do want to add kind of a caveat, or I guess just like an extra layer to this, because I imagine there's a lot of new players that are listening to this right now and they're thinking, oh my God, Gilbert's tier is like terrible. People are like super toxic, all of that kind of stuff. I think what Sneb is describing, like, of course, there are bad apples that happen. People that join the LFG don't read, don't communicate, don't do like, don't play as if they're part of the group, that sort of thing. But I think the vast majority of players are quite understanding. Like if I've had a couple of times where people join the LFG and I'm like, hey, we said we're specifically looking for this thing. And they'll be like, oh, my bad. Sorry, I didn't read carefully enough. And then they'll just quietly dip out and leave. I think that's more of the norm, more so than people like specifically saying, oh my gosh, how dare you try to control how I'm playing, or like that sort of thing. I just want to add that there.
To further stall the unleash of Nike, to really get the build-up going, actually, I will reinforce that and go a step further. I would go even further than this. I think people think that people enforce the meta way stricter than they actually do. If you join a group on Heal Tempest, are you going to get kicked? No. Okay, maybe like in like one group out of like 20, people will go like, oh, you're playing Ellie, you big noob, right? Yeah, sure, like it might happen at some point. But one, those people are idiots and probably aren't very good, so you've dodged a bullet. And secondly, it's not going to happen very often. And this is actually less so on damage rolls. Honestly, if you play a build that and just do vaguely good damage, no one cares. You can play Reaper, you can play Vindicator. Honestly, you could probably even get away with some like really crazy shit like Spellbreaker. You might be pushing it a little bit there, but honestly, after the last buffs, you'll probably get away with it. The issue here is that obviously you only ever hear about all of the negative experiences, right? You don't see a Reddit post that says, I played 7 raid bosses today on Tempest and I didn't get kicked. But you're absolutely going to see the Reddit post of the guy that says, I joined a raid group and they said, you noob Ellie, me kick, right? You're going to see that post. But you're not going to go like, I successfully cleared raids today with this slightly unusual build, right? Maybe we should see more posts like that, actually. I think that would actually be really cool if we did. I think that kind of goes into what yourself and Sneb were both mentioning about seeing representation in the community of people playing these builds, right? And succeeding with them, right? But yeah, there you go.
Okay. I got to add because otherwise people are gonna attack me for this.
Yeah,
I actually agree that people adhere to the meta too strongly, but my point is that if somebody chooses to adhere to the meta, I don't understand why we feel like they're evil, right? And what I mean by this is if somebody is saying, hey, I'm looking for 2 heal firebrands, like if they post in their LFG, this is what I'm looking for to build out my squad, why are we villainizing that person? They had to go and make the group. Like they did the hardest part. If you're upset that they're not looking for the thing that you're playing, then make your own group and look for things as well. And then, or if you're upset with their requirements, then counter it. And I say this as someone who did that because I got kicked a ton when I first started raiding because I didn't have KP, I didn't have anything, I got flamed out, I wasn't that good, I didn't know all the mechanics, and I just was like, well, screw it, I'm going to make my own group and set my own parameters. And it works so much better. You're so much happier because then you're playing the way that you want and you're playing with people that also want to play how you've described. As long as you're very clear about how you want to play and like what the requirements are for the group, then it should be okay. I just, again, I don't understand. It feels very entitled for people to say, well, I am upset that a person is asking for specific things because that's not how I want to play. I want to tell you this. You bought the game, you can choose how you want to play. But you can also choose who you play with and how you play with them and how you engage with those groups. There are people that, yeah, they're total jerks. You don't want to play with them anyway. So find ways to change the culture by being the change. Start your own groups. Do non-meta runs. Don't care about boons if that's really what you got. I would advise you to care about boons because boons are very powerful. But if you don't care about those things and you don't want to hear it from a commander, then my advice is to find a community, a group of people that think similarly to you because they're out there. It just takes a little extra step.
I think something also to mention is that a little communication can go a really long way because I've organized like semi-EXP or like new player friendly runs where pretty much the only thing I do is I bully 3 guildies and myself into playing support roles. And then we just tag up an LFG, be like, all welcome, everyone is welcome to join it, that sort of thing. And occasionally we get to like an encounter where it's pretty difficult and there are like mechanics where like, you know, new players would have to like deal with, otherwise everyone is going to wipe. And speaking from personal experience, I look upon someone who's playing an off meta build but is a lot more communicative a lot better than someone who might just be like face rolling a meta build but then gets antagonistic or hostile, or not even like quite that far. Let's just say like they're ignoring me, right? Like I think that in a way it kind of brings back this full circle where it's like a lot of the meta is defined off of player perception. And I think just in general, if you're playing a build and you're being reasonable and you're pulling pretty good DPS and you're just a fun person to hang around with, you're making a much bigger impact on the meta than someone who is pulling top DPS but is a complete asshole. So I just really want to bring that up because I feel like someone mentioned like, we don't want new players to be responsible for success when they have no idea how to even get there. And I guess the point that I want to make is that I think there are a lot of tools to be successful at the game in whatever way you want to measure it, whether it's clearing the encounter, learning a different class, learning how to be top DPS, learning how to be a good support, that sort of stuff. But a lot of it just kind of boils down to like, how willing are you to engage with the community? Because an MMO is a pretty inherently social experience. If you play it as if it's a single player game, whether that's adhering to the meta or not adhering to the meta, then it's going to be a pretty bad time. So.
Yeah, I also just want to give a shout out to the people that do trainings and stuff and make the community a better place. But also, if you are an experienced player and you're looking for a specific role or something and somebody joins they don't have that, my advice to you is to try to A, give them a shot, or B, be very polite to them. Because I feel like every time somebody has a negative experience, it just adds more and more fuel to the fire. And as Teapot suggested, that's what people remember, and that's the impression that they will have. I've spoken to people who have said, yeah, I played the game, and then I quit the game for a while, and I quit because I felt like the meta was so rigid that I couldn't play the game. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, I played X, and at the time, and apparently the meta used to be way more strict. That was my understanding. It used to be way more strict, like way back in the early days. And it's certainly not that way now. It doesn't have to be as strict. Maybe there's some lingering tension with that. But regardless, people remember the way that they felt when they were excluded constantly, right? And so by putting yourself in maybe a slightly more uncomfortable situation because you're going to allow somebody that you maybe weren't looking for that exact role, but they want to play that role and it would probably be fine anyway because you'll still have the boons. By allowing those things to happen and by being very polite and kind to people, you'll create a better community and people won't have such negative responses. I actually feel the reason that Endgame isn't as popular in Guild Wars 2 is solely because, well, not solely, but it was because a long time ago, a lot of people felt really excluded and then spread that narrative as far as it would go. And now that narrative remains intact because that's what people remember. I've spoken to people on social media and they're like, yeah, raiding should be deleted because it's toxic and it's a horrible experience. And, I was excluded. And I say, have you ever joined a raid in the last 3 years? And they'll say no. They've never even tried. But that experience 3 years ago allows them to perpetuate this stereotype. And while there may be some truth to, maybe raiders are a little bit more competitive or hardcore or whatever, I think you'd be surprised to know that, I think people would be surprised to know that there are a whole lot of people that spend a whole lot of their time just trying to help other players get into raids. A lot. I know a lot of them. I interact with a lot of them. And they care a whole lot and they're patient and kind. And so I wish that we could spread that more than the negative stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a super key point there actually about that, and it certainly is true. It's almost like the meta conversation. It's actually the conversation about the conversation that skews the actual result more than the actual game. It's crazy. But yeah, I completely agree. Right? We can have a meta conversation maybe a little bit after this. Nike is joined to unchain, to unleash. He said that he's itching. The skin is itching. The keyboard is being randomly spammed. There was like some going on there. Unchain, unleash, do it.
Okay, so I'm going to have a counter position on the raid training situation.
Ooh.
I think that there is a high amount of raid trainers who are competent and are in it for the right reasons of trying to grow the community. But there's a small but very noticeable subset of raid trainers who are in it for the ego stroke of carrying noobs through content and then getting the praise from the noobs for carrying them through content. And those people are pretty negative and a bad influence because they're not actually teaching. They're not taking the time to teach. They're just playing like Heel Scourge or something similar, carrying people through like their first sloth kill and going, haha, I'm not only a great player, I'm also a good person for having done this charity. And yeah, that's not good. But I'm not going to name names, no way.
Yeah,
but but there are some.
Does that does that happen a lot though? I feel like a lot of training guilds actually really don't like Heal Scourge, and I understand why as well.
I think a lot of the training guilds have tried to weed out that sort of person from their communities because they're not actually training. They're not actually explaining mechanics. They're just carrying. But it's a Twitch thing, I think. It's where I've noticed it anyway, is that there's a few streamers in the community. I'm not going to name names, but they, they're in it for themselves and not to grow the community.
Huh.
I feel attacked, but it's probably not me.
It's not you. It's no one in the call.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely break out the Heal Scourge if I've like wiped 10 times. If you're doing like a training run and you're like, okay, right, we've done 10 attempts, I'll play Heal Scourge and we'll just get it done. I think that's good because I believe that when it comes down to training, I think success and positive experiences are key. To me, and I'm actually just speaking out this from my experience, nothing feels worse to me than like grinding a boss for 2 hours with the gang and then not killing it. It's like, oh no, right? Like at that point, it's like, okay, we've got some good practice in. Let's just fucking kill it, right? Let's just get it done. We break out the cheese. We're getting the cheese out of the fridge and eating it, okay? And just get it done. Because, oh man, it just feels so bad. You know, I feel like I've let the group down, you know, like when I'm doing, like, I used to do this all the time, right? I mean, this actually destroyed my sleep schedule. You know, I would do like 10-hour Demos streams because I would refuse to stop until we kill it. Like, and if people try to leave, I say, no, you're not allowed to leave. You're getting the fucking kill. No, yeah, stay up, okay? Skip work tomorrow. Don't go to school tomorrow. We're killing Demos, okay? Don't go in the oil.
Yeah, I think sort of the sentiment I'm getting at, and I've seen some streamers in the community tweet this, that like they're like, did a wing 1 through 4 training tonight, and we one-shot every boss. And I'm thinking to myself, either you didn't have very many noobs in the group, or you were just like letting them die and then like 8-manning, you know? like you weren't actually training. If you one-shot every boss in training, the people aren't learning anything. They're learning literally nothing.
Are there different ways to train? I've actually thought a lot about this because I've been trying to change the way that we do training, at least in my guild, because I really dislike when you say, all right, I'm going to do training, and then everybody shows, and you even plan it in advance. You say, we're going to do wing 1. These are the bosses that we're going to do. And everybody shows up, and they have never seen anyone do it. They've never watched a YouTube video. They didn't look anything up. They have no idea what to expect. I find that to be just a little counterproductive, because then what happens is the trainer opens up the wiki page and reads the wiki page to them for like 20 minutes. And I just find that to be a little bit perplexing, because to me, the better way to train is to get reps, to go in and do the thing. And so the preamble of how to do everything, and I just find that to be a bit of a waste of time. If you're gathering 10 people up, you know, it took a while to get the whole group together, to organize it. It's explaining how to do the thing in that precious time is a bit of a waste. So what I've been trying to encourage people to do is, hey, you're going to do a wing 1 training. These are the bosses. These are the resources that you can look up for the guides, like hardstuck.gg, for example. You can go take a look at the guide there. You don't have to go study it like it's a test or anything, but just go give it a look. Then when we do our training, I'll call out the mechanics as they're happening, and I'll constantly be teaching as we're doing it, but we're just going to do pulls. We're just going to keep going. Like, if we fail a mechanic, that's totally good. We'll re-emphasize what the mechanic is, why it's important, but we're not going to do 20-minute preamble, because you won't remember half the stuff anyway, and because it wastes everybody's time, because they could have read that information on the wiki or something.
I'll add a bit of a take here, because I've also run trainings before, and I know that the way you and I train is very, very different. I think they're both effective, but the way I do it is much more incremental. So instead of explaining all of the mechanics all at the start in that 20-minute preamble that you're saying, I'll usually like just target the first 20%, be like, hey, here are the 2 key mechanics that you have to watch out for here. And then what I do is I basically force the group to wipe to those mechanics at least 2 or 3 times. Like, I'll tell everyone, all right, we're literally going to get to 80% and everyone is going to /GG, regardless of how well people people are performing, just so they can
Really?
get in those reps and stuff. Yeah.
Hardcore.
And then
Yeah.
after that, we target the next 30%. So we go down to like 50% or something like that. And what I've found is that it's actually really good, not just because it helps internalize those mechanics more, right? Like people can kind of match like the theory of it to the actual like executing those mechanics, but also it's a lot less overwhelming, because what I've found is when people read guides and when they watch YouTube videos or when they listen to that 20-minute preamble and everything, they tend to kind of start glossing over stuff, right? Like it's kind of hard to match like, oh, what was I supposed to do here? I saw the greens. Is that me teleporting, or do you have to run away from it? Do I have to run into it? All of that kind of stuff. And it can just get super, super, super overwhelming. So I found that the incremental way, usually I see some people saying that it takes forever. I actually disagree. I've taken full squads of, okay, maybe not full squads. I've snuck in 1 or 2 like experienced guildies in there, but at least 7 or 8 people that have never done raids before. And we're able to get a full like ring 1 clear in less than 2 hours, which I would argue is pretty good considering most of them have never experienced the mechanics before. So yeah, I think that helps a lot. And then also what helps a lot for me as the commander is kind of like to streamline the process of training, if that makes any sense. Like the way that I set it up in my Discord is I tell people like, this is the team comp we're going to run. We're going to run 2 quickness, 2 alacrity, 6 DPS. And I actually have a bot called Aliva.io. If any other raid trainers are interested, it's a fantastic tool that was recommended to me. And basically people can sign up by pressing the sign up button, and a bot will whisper them with a bunch of questions, and it'll basically put them into one of the assigned roles. When I do that, I don't have to worry about organizing the squad. I just assume that everybody already knows like the position that they're going to play. And then once we actually get into the encounter, then I can target it, right? It's like your quickness uptime is only 50%. Double check your build or like that sort of thing. So
flame them.
Yeah. Well, not flame them, but
that's when you start flaming. That's when Emmy starts going crazy, popping off. Where is my quickness, trainee? Hand it over.
I am only that mean to my regulars. Like I've roasted Kessie, Magus, all of them too many times. Like, how dare you give me only 95% quickness uptime? Do you realize how much damage you've taken from me? But no, I think I guess kind of to like tie it back is that I think a lot of the times with raid training, there's obviously different types of, oh my gosh, it's a baby. Sorry. Yeah. But there's a lot of different, like, I guess, expectations, right? Like you have some groups where the expectation is people are going in blind. They have no idea what's going on. And then you kind of have like the expectation of, that you already kind of know what you're doing. This is kind of a semi-XP run. This is more of a practice run. I'm not going to explain the mechanics. This is just for you to, like get your reps in. And then there's kind of like the third kind where it's kind of like, all right, we're just going to go do this for fun, get people as many kills as possible. And you kind of wheelchair scourge them through. And then you have like the 4th level, which is like everybody is self-sufficient and they're able to clear the encounter. So I think what Nike is talking about is kind of on the 3rd one. I think that's okay in some scenarios, but it's probably a bit of false advertising to treat that as a training more so than let's just get people their clears because they need LI for their raid armor.
I think training is something very specific. It's a very specific type of group. It's not a group where everyone knows what's going on. It's also not a group where nobody knows what's going on though. And I think that sometimes it gets a little bit it's a bit mushy and people maybe attribute training to something that actually isn't. Training to me is definitely like 1 or 2 players teaching other players, right? The goal is not even necessarily to kill it. Not always anyway. In my opinion, it always should be. And part of that is actually context. For example, if I was doing a training group for Veil Guardian, I would be very disappointed if we didn't kill it. Because in my opinion, it is very realistic to kill Veil Guardian, pretty quickly, right? Like, if one player knows how it works and everyone's got a vaguely good build, you can absolutely get players to the standard where they can understand and complete that encounter very early on. However, if I was doing a Harvest Temple challenge mode training run, I'm not expecting to kill it day 1, right? Obviously, it's a very different thing. So it's heavily situational, depending on the difficulty of the encounter, the experience level of the group even, and of course the experience level of the trainer themselves, and the way you even approach it. Like, are you gonna play? Are you gonna say, right, listen, I think a good example would actually be like a mid-level encounter. Like, let's say that we were doing a Doom CM training run. Now,
Doom CM is mid-level.
I would say that, yeah, I'd say it's actually a mid-level encounter. Yeah, it actually is. No, I know that sounds actually slightly unhinged, but it is actually, I would say, a mid-level encounter, considering how much harder how much more complicated some other things are. Actually, Doom CM is like, it's okay, fine. It's like mid-high level, right? Like it's a harder encounter in the game. Like, I'll just rephrase. It doesn't really matter. But Doom CM, if you do a training run, do you say, hey, play this DPS class? Because that's a different approach. I think the example is, would you play double heal mech, double firebrand, 6 scourges? Or are you going to play, let's say we keep the supports name, double heal mech, double firebrand, then 6 weavers, right? And say, hey, you know, just play whatever you want. There's actually I know, and this is where I'm bringing it back into the metagame, boys. Oh yeah. You can we're reconnecting it. We're going full circle. We're bringing the loop round. There's a really big difference in the approach where you say, okay, let's actually break the game as hard as we can and play like the really, really strong builds for this encounter, right? Like everyone play Power Mech, everyone play Scourge. And there's actually something to be said for that as well, because if you play a build that's you know, easier to handle in an encounter, it's going to be easier to learn the mechanics in a lot of ways, right? Because you're not like, oh, I gotta press my buttons, what's going on? You can just go, oh yeah, don't mind me. Don't mind my mech just, you know, destroying Doom 1v1. Don't mind me. I'm having a good time. But yeah, there you go.
Well,
yeah.
One other thing I want to say about the meta, you touched on it earlier about how really what it should mean is the way that players approach the game. And I think one thing that people take for granted is the paradigm of healer slash quickness or slash alacrity plus the complementary boon on a hybrid, and then the rest DPS as like your basic squad construction. That is not the most efficient way to play the game, but it's also not the least efficient way to play the game. It's just an artificial thing that the community has settled upon because it strikes the balance between efficiency and ease of group formation. Because you could very easily say that, 4 hybrids that do boons, heals, and DPS, and then like 1 DPS, pure DPS per squad is that's a totally viable way to construct a squad. You could do that and you could kill every boss, and you could even do it with really good times. But that's not how the community approaches the game, and the community would reject that if you tried to like force it. They would not be happy with that. So it is interesting how that works, that the current paradigm, no one ever decided that that was the way to do it. It just evolved sort of naturally. And it's, again, not the least efficient way to do it, but also not the most efficient way to do it. So it's interesting, especially when you look at like raid records. Every record that's been set in the last 3 years has been set because they broke that paradigm,
of course,
in some way or another. And at this point, that's the only way to break a raid record, is breaking that paradigm.
I think,
interestingly,
I think you've definitely touched on a really important topic there. I think this is like one that things got wild in the middle of this tea time. I actually wanted to bring this up a lot earlier, actually, but I think there's a lot of kind of things going on the background that actually that also define the meta. Specifically, the easier it is to actually build a group around something is a massive factor in what's going to be a popular build. And actually, I'm going to go a step further. I actually think the raid metagame is hugely impacted by fractals, actually. I think one of the and I would actually highlight this with Heal Firebrand. This is less true now. It was definitely a lot more true pre-EOD. But before EOD, Heal Firebrand was actually very mediocre, in my opinion, because Tempest existed, Druid existed, like there were, and Heal Scourge existed, right? Like Firebrand was actually shockingly mediocre, but everyone played Heal Firebrand because everyone has Heal Firebrand, and it's very easy to build a group around Heal Firebrand. And everyone has Heal Firebrand because it was busted as hell in Fractals, right? And still is ultimately. With EOD, it's a lot more justified because basically the super busted builds like Tempest, Druid, and Scourge all got nerfed like mega hard, right? So as a result of that, Firebrand didn't get nerfed because it was already 5 targets. So relatively, if you actually think about that numerically, that's insane. Tempest ate a 50% nerf, and Guardian, as a result of that, kind of gets twice as good relative to Tempest, kind of maybe a little bit, right? If you really think about it, that's actually wild, right? How significant that change was. But yeah, that's something. Same thing with, well, I guess not with Heal Scourge. Heal Scourge didn't get nerfed. Fun fact. But yeah. But, well, Heal Scourge was enabled by 10 targets. But that's another story. But yeah, I think that's actually a really important thing to consider as well. And I would say that this is particularly true with heal builds, actually, because this is something that I really kind of expressed during the tier list as well. If you look at the actual defensive supports that are in the game, and funnily enough, the defensive support typically, would you guys say it would be fair to say that the defensive support typically defines the metagame, at least in pugs? I would say that's true.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. That's where you start.
Yeah. And because that area of the game actually is the least diverse, offensive supports are actually really diverse. DPS also pretty diverse too, actually. But defensive supports are very lacking, actually. You've kind of got Mech is pretty far ahead of other stuff. Then you've got Firebrand, then Druid, then Tempest, and Heal Rev, and so on. There's a lot lower diversity there. And because of that, people are always going to gravitate to the top ones, specifically Firebrand and Mech. And here's where things get really funky and really fun. Those two healers have very specific synergies. In other words, there are some offensive supports that go really well with those ones. Great example. Firebrand, coincidentally, goes really fucking well with Mech. It's a perfect combo. Goodness me. Think of your favorite pizza topping. Think of your favorite ice cream sundae. That is Firebrand and Mech. Oh my God. Oh, no, I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear that. Okay, but yeah.
Grasshoppers.
Oh, interesting. Grasshoppers. The bugs. But yeah, like they really do go very well together. And because of that, that kind of duo dominates insanely hard because everyone's got it because of fractals and they go together extremely well. And other support options are just they just don't quite synergize as well, right? With the current meta. And that's another layer of complexity on top of the metagame that's like, holy shit, now we're getting weird, right? We have like all these things interacting with each other, and the interactions between those things actually affects how they fit into the metagame and therefore how popular they are because of not even their own abilities, but because of the interaction of their abilities with other classes. And congratulations, now things have got very confusing. And yeah, a big part of it is because if they give quickness or alacrity as well. The fact that there aren't the quickness healers underperform compared to the alacrity healers, yeah, that's actually a big deal. And funnily enough, the other way around is true too, which makes it even worse. Alacrity offensive supports actually underperform compared to quickness offensive supports as well. The exception will be Spectre, obviously, but if you look at something like, let's say, aggressive Alacrity Tempest, it's not quite as good. Although I guess Alac Mech is pretty good. Power Mech is good. But I think in general, quickness, offensive supports are better and more versatile. Think Firebrand and Herald. But yeah, also Nike is dead. We're actually doing some kind of,
seance.
Weird, seance thing, communicating from beyond the grave. He's actually been reincarnated. I can quickly show it here, actually. He's been reincarnated as the Chipotle Mexican Grill logo. Here you go. I'm just going to briefly show that on stream.
I mean, I'm in mourning, so I don't really want to appear live.
Yeah. There you go.
I feel like I'm out of the loop. I don't get it. So there's something I've missed.
It's a real classic meme. Actually, wait, doesn't the Chipotle thing like originate really back in the day? Actually, it was like
we were trying to get sponsors for the dungeon tournament, and I was like, "Fuck it, let's just write Chipotle and ask them for a prize support for the tournament." And they sent us back saying that they're not looking to move into esports at this time. And we're like, okay, that's reasonable. And then like a week later, they announced like some esports partnership with some org. And I'm like, these fuckers, like, what the fuck? So I'm just like, well, whatever. I'm just going to say I did. And I said I did get sponsored just to see who would believe it. And I kept it up for like years, and people believed that we were completely sponsored by Chipotle.
There you go. That's the explanation. And funnily enough, actually, like the logo for TeaTime is very much kind of based off that design as well. It's something that Brazil made a very long time ago. We came up with the name. That's there you go. We're infringing copyright every single week here. Love to see it.
Nice.
Oh my.
Yeah, I don't know where to go from there.
I feel like we've like.
They also need to buff alacrity builds.
True.
Oh, I guess that's
the hybrid alacrity builds for especially for open world. No one plays alacrity in open world. No one, and it's terrible.
It's why I always feel compelled to play mech, because I need the green numbers. It upsets me to not have them.
And if I do play alacrity, it feels terrible because then all of a sudden I don't have quickness, and like not having quickness is the worst. Yeah. So it's just really something they just need to. I think the problem is just like alacrity builds feel like if you're playing solo PvE, like and just running around open world, it doesn't feel good. Like you don't feel like the alacrity is self buffing you enough to justify what you have to give up to make it. And so the build feels anemic and you're like, screw this. And then you go play Firebrand in open world and it feels great even without alacrity. Yeah. Like you're still pumping.
Quickness feels, it definitely feels more, it's like more immediately impactful to your gameplay than alacrity is. Alacrity is very strong, but it's strong in a different way. Whereas quickness is like, holy shit, I'm fast. Look at me go. Look at all my abilities. Which is a lot of fun.
Yep. And they need to make super speed a boon.
Oh, interesting. A boon, huh?
Yep.
So, I mean, that would make it removable. Oh, man. That would be
it's
ouchy in World vs. World.
Yeah, like corrupt it into immobilize.
Oh,
like, that would be the dream.
That's how you nerf Scrapper. You make him super speed corrupt into immobilize. Oh.
Yeah, let him do it. But yeah, like super speed is like a vestigial organ from the days when quickness wasn't a boon at launch. They have like even like similar icons to what quickness had at launch. And just need to modernize it, bring it to a boon.
Yeah. You could almost I'm not sure I'd make it into a boon. I would maybe, this would be super weird actually. I'd almost replace it, just remove super speed from the game and replace it with resistance. Because that's kind of the same thing in some respect. Now we're getting really off topic, but it's an interesting one. Because resistance makes you ignore stuff like chill, cripple, and so on. That's kind of what resistance, super speed does. Except obviously resistance makes you ignore stuff like slow and blind as well. So it would be a buff, but it kind of serves the same purpose. It also makes you go out of speed, movement speed in combat, which is actually very, very strong. But if you wanted to like strip down the complexity and remove unique modifiers, you could probably go in that direction with that. Super speed does use, we need super speed in World vs. World though. Yes, but one of the principal uses of super speed in World vs. World actually is to ignore movement impairing effects, actually. Specifically, if you get slowed down, super speed makes it so you don't get slowed down. Even if you don't have resistance, you wouldn't get slowed down by it. That honestly might be, in its current state, that level of uptime would probably be a bit busto, because resistance is pretty insane, actually. But yeah, like it's yeah. Honestly, super speed is kind of a weird thing in the game. It's kind of crazy, to be honest. But yeah, there you go.
The other thing I wanted to add is ArenaNet. You know how like each balance patch, like the major ones have like a theme. I think one of the themes coming up needs to be a balance pass over the core utility skills of every profession.
True. Big true, actually.
They don't need to be brought up all the way to elite spec power level, because there should be obviously opportunity cost. Like you should want to have to take a spec to get like a certain level of power. But compare like Force Signet on mech to like any other core classes based signet. Like maybe only the Thief Assassin Signet is close, but like my God, the Force Signet is insane. Absolutely insane. Everything else is like 180 power, and that's 10% damage. Like, wow.
You know what? I'm actually gonna allow me to slightly disagree with you there, Nike. I think there are some core abilities, and actually I think this is a really big defining part on which professions crop up a lot, that are actually insane. I would actually argue that Stand Your Ground is one of the best skills in the entire game, core or elite, no questions asked.
Yeah, I'm not saying buff everything. I'm just saying do a balance pass where you're like, is this skill shit? And then if it is, bring it up a little bit.
What I mean is that I think it's actually okay for... or actually, maybe it's not okay. Maybe core abilities being too strong actually is really problematic because it means that you can use them on every single elite spec. That actually might be a good take actually. Yeah, because
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, you don't want to bring them up. You don't want to bring them up too high because then you'll just shop for elite specs based on which one has the most damage mods, and then you'll use all core utilities.
Yeah, it's true. I think Elementalist is probably the one that's the most obvious.
Yeah.
Elementalist utility skills, they're a bit depressing, but it's actually even worse than that, right? Because they're quite often very important to your damage output. So not only do you have like low flexibility and low value, you also don't have any free slots because you have to do damage with them. It's the only, otherwise you're a noodle, right? You become a noodle, which is not great.
Yeah, like what's the LE Blink? Compare that to like the
Shift
Mechanist.
Signet. Oh my god!
Compared to Shift Signet, it's like my god. The LE Blink could like hit for like 25,000 and it would still be not as good as Shift Signet.
That ability is crazy. 1200 range blink, stun break, 2 condies removed, and it's a massive, colossal DPS increase because it copies all of your boons to the mech.
Pretty good. I'm surprised they didn't try to make it do more. That seems pretty anemic.
You think it needs to be more? Oh, no, sorry. It gives you more passive movements for you as well. I apologize.
Okay,
I was actually wrong.
Yeah,
it also makes you go faster.
And then there's like really bad warrior and ranger core skills too, like real bad. Those need to be fixed. And like, I don't know, Mesmer has there's a lot they could do. But that would be a fun patch, I think.
Okay. Actually, you kind of touched on it, but like, I guess like any skill that's multifunctional, right? Like if it does multiple things, is always going to be better than one skill that only does one thing. Like Blink on Mesmer just gives you a teleport, I guess, but Mech shifts it gives so much more. I think you see it a lot also with like special action keys and stuff. Like the special action keys, like in encounters that are really strong, are those that do a lot of things. Like in Fractals, 99 CM, right? It's like it's a stun break, it's a CC. It's damage even. It's like, you can use it to cheese mechanics, that sort of stuff. Yeah. But then you have the special action keys in Ice Spirit Saga where you shoot a beam, pew pew, and that's kind of it.
I have one random thing to add for the end of TeaTime.
Do it.
One random thing. It's kind of off the cuff, but whatever.
Okay. Let's do it.
So for those that don't know, I used to run Drakkar like every day. That was my thing. That's how I got into streaming and how I got into content creation. All that. I used to run Drakkar, and we used to make it really fun, and that's what my whole community was centered around. Now, obviously, that's shifted over time, but I hadn't been to Drakkar in many months, like pre-EOD. It feels like I hadn't been to Drakkar in a long time, and I went to Drakkar recently.
Okay.
And before, when I was running Drakkar, it used to be really hard to get the 20% phase done without Drakkar moving to another place in the wall. Like if you're able to do that, your DPS was really high. Like your group was really solid. And typically you're using subgroups and all of that. I just did Drakkar, and we killed it 20% every phase in a random pickup group in the LFG with no subgroups. Is this power creep? Like that was so fast. And I was kind of stunned, to be honest, because people were still getting hit by mechanics. There was almost no organization. Nobody said what portals to do. They just obliterated it. I mean, I was looking, I didn't have quickness half the time. I had alacrity because I was providing alacrity, but
it's Ended Dragons.
They killed that so fast. I'm just kind of blown away because I don't know. That's just so fast. Is this power creep?
I think it is a little bit of power creep, but I also do think the player base in general is better at the game. Like I feel like I've joined random pug groups, I've joined random fractal groups, strike missions, even like open world stuff like I've been doing Dragon Stand quite a bit. So every single time I do them, just across the board, damage numbers are higher, even on like non-mech classes. I feel like people just now understand that there is a criteria that they are probably being measured by, and that they are able to bring a lot more to the table. So
I would agree. I think Dragon's End did a huge favor to the community and making them realize that there was a bar and that they totally could hit that bar. They just had to make some minor changes, right? And I think people are way better off because of that.
I think players have definitely got a little bit. I think Ender Dragons definitely raised the bar on the open world content, and that has definitely improved the player base. But I do actually think, and by the way, I mean this as a point of praise and not as a point of criticism, by the way. I think End of Dragons massively lowered the skill floor to the game. I think it made it way easier to start your journey of learning a lot. Because I think that a lot of builds and a lot of the way the game functioned before Ender Dragons was somewhat opaque, actually, and a little bit hard to kind of get your first foot on the first rung of the ladder, actually. But Ender Dragons, I think, made the skill floor way lower and way more accessible to the game. And a lot of that was making all of the core weapon skills way better, looking at core trait lines and making them better, right? Just all these kind of changes, I think, have just raised the floor massively in terms of damage output. I think just boon performance is way easier. Everything is much easier to get started on, right? To begin, right, with that.
Yeah, I do want to kind of add something here, because while we're on the topic of power creep, so the way I kind of see power creep is that we're doing more damage, we're providing more buffs, we're providing more utility, more CC, more whatever it is than before. But I would actually kind of argue the opposite. I feel like with a lot of the sweeping changes they made to things like banners, spirits, signets, all of that kind of stuff, I think players are actually doing, or the damage capability of players is actually lower than what it was 6 months ago. I think that's something to bring up. It's like doing Dragon Stand in the past, if you had 20 really, really, really good players, they would be able to do it just as fast as people are doing it right now. I think that's like kind of the difference between power creep versus players getting better, is that right now players are just performing better within the bounds that have already existed.
Yeah,
I see a lot of nodding.
I don't know if that's true.
Emmy's
no.
Right.
Wait, no. But there's one point there. I feel like when they got rid of banners and stuff, okay, maybe I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that there are things that have higher damage and boon output capabilities than before. And so removing things like banners and whatever, if banners still existed, obviously you'd do more damage. But with, a surge and things that all do more damage just right off the cuff, the average damage of players should have increased, not decreased.
No. To be clear, no. You don't. That's not quite the same thing. That's not what Emmy was saying. Emmy was saying that the overall maximum power level of the game has gone down. This is true. Outside of a few exceptions. I guess the exceptions would be stuff like Bladesworn, because that build is kind of wild. Even that is actually somewhat similar, actually, to what was happening before EOD. But yes, EOD was super interesting. It de-power crept the game, because we went from 10 target to 5. So stuff like Righteous Rebel died, and so on, etc. Time Warp died, and so on, and so on, and so on. Right? But the floor went up. So yes, the average player is doing way better, but the absolute extreme maximum level is lower, right? Yeah, like losing.
Okay, I understand that. Yeah, that's 100% true.
The big thing with banners, right, was that it just kind of noodled every build, right? Like, I don't think people really realize just how fucking good banners really were. Like, yeah, they were very good.
They did quite a bit.
Yeah. I agree.
I think people are just playing stuff now, though. Like, aren't they just like playing better builds and things?
I mean, but being able to recognize that a build is stronger and being able to actually execute it is an increase in player skill. 100%. Like, obviously, maybe not like to the degree like, oh, this person can like play Axe Mirage and get 44k on like SH or like self stats, or like maybe not quite to that level. But I still do genuinely think, like, just in general, whenever I like pug things nowadays, whether it's open world metas or instance content, I feel like people are more willing to like learn the mechanics, or more honestly, more willing to take responsibility for mechanics. Like I remember back in the day, I had to like bribe people to do stab at the cannons. I literally had to be like, all right, whoever does this one, I'll give you my undying love as well as like 100 gold over each or something like that. But nowadays, like people are just more willing to jump in, volunteer their skills, or even say things like, yeah, I can try it out if you want me to. And I think there's just been a general like attitude and like almost cultural shift. So
Yeah,
I mean, to be fair, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the key word there for me was cultural shift. I'm curious if it was anything the game did that spurred that cultural shift, or if it was just the player base over time just being like, yo, we want to do this faster and more efficient, and there's reason to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's less of a fear of failure, right? It's like before, if you're playing a super complex build or something like that, if you messed up, it would be very, very noticeable. But now with the rise of like, I think just in general, like the low intensity builds that were super popularized, just in general, like the classes being a little bit easier to play, I think there is kind of this perception of if I mess this up, it's not that big of a deal because I can recover very easily. And I think that just makes people braver. I think you see that a lot with the emboldened raids as well. It's like when you tell people, hey, if you mess up, you're going to get this thing that'll make the encounter easier for people later. I think people are a lot more daring. And I do think that, I mean, that's literally a cultural shift. So.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it too much until we're talking about it now. But I would agree 100%. What I've noticed is that people are so much more willing to put themselves out there than before. Yeah. They are not afraid. And I think it's really refreshing because like a similar experience to you, I used to like beg people to try the mechanics. I'd be like, please, I'll do it with you. Like I'll tell you exactly how to do it. Like, please just do it. And now so many people are like, yeah, I guess I can try it. Like, what's the worst that could happen?
I think that's because exactly because of the lowered skill floor, right? Because players now, it becomes more accessible. It feels more in reach, right? It's because I think previously it's like, oh man, I've got to practice all of this. I've got to do that. I've got to do this to get to that level, man. But with Ender Dragons, a lot of things got a lot easier to take your first step. And then I think after you've taken, I think this is probably even like something you have science on, right? The first step is going to be the hardest one to take, right? Like trying it for the first time is okay. I think there's like, isn't there that weird kind of bird meme, right? Where it's like, keep this thing away from me, right? Then the bird gets a little taste like, ooh, actually that's quite nice, right? That's kind of what's happening here in my opinion. It's, players were somewhat intimidated by all the procedure and steps you have to do to basically get better at the game. But when the baseline is easier to get to and you have that starting point, I think all of a sudden you're going to have way more confidence and way more ability to actually take the next steps, right? It's kind of like, I guess, the difference between like having to like jump onto a platform compared to having a nice kind of staircase that will take you up to the platform. Whereas I feel like before it was more of a jump. I mean, we talk about this a lot, right? How the first step, I mean, look, this is the Dragon's End conversation, right, Sneb? Like, it's the learning the basics of the game is the hardest part. Everything else after that is easier. I think what Ender Dragons has done is make the basics easier, right? So learning these things about boons, about doing damage, about how to attack bosses, about how to survive, because that's become easier. Players are much more inclined to kind of continue along the journey, along the path.
Cool. I think it's exciting for the game.
It is exciting, yeah. And that's why the next meta event will be harder than Dragon's End. It's back, and a full mount skin will be locked behind it.
Good.
Yeah.
We've already shaken the fleas off with Dragon's End, so now we're safe to do it.
You'll fight 3 Suwons at the same time, very much like Triple Trouble Worm. All of them will burst out of the ground.
Holy crap, that'd actually be so fun if it was like the same. Oh, imagine if it was the same like arena, like that pillar in the sky, but they were in like a triangle. So there was 3 and you had to like split up and handle, but they were all doing different mechanics randomly at the same time.
More than 3 Suwons. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further.
It's even more toxic. 3 dooms appear. Ooh. They gear check you. And if you don't have 6 matching runes, you instantly get kicked out of the map. Like literally you get put back in Echovold Wilds.
Yeah.
Like
banned from the game for 7 days.
Yep. 7-day ban.
You actually fight all dragon aspects at the same time, or all of the dragons at the same time. So there's new Su-1, but on each of those Jade platforms around Su-1, you have to actually fight Zaitan, Kralkatoric, Mordramoth, Primordus, and Jormag all at the same time, and Su-1 is there. Su-1 also visits each platform individually and also does additional mechanics sometimes. Below 50% health, Doom CM spawns, and below every 10%, an additional Doom CM spawns. When I say Doom CM, I mean Ender's Echo. Additionally, below 10%, Kadim appears as well.
And if you fall off the platform, the game deletes your character.
And every 10%, the bottom 10% of DPS gets killed. Just automatically dead.
Healers in shamble.
Yep.
You get hit by any mechanic, all of your gold is immediately transferred to somebody else randomly in the game.
Yeah.
And then one phase is insanity, full loot PvP.
Oh, shit. Oh, at the end, Drakkar appears, drives you all insane, and it's a battle to the death, and only one player can loot the chest.
Give us to Battle Royale.
Then you wake up and you're actually playing Fortnite. What?
I like that.
It's all a dream narrative.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, just not to worry anyone, just in case, by the way, that's not actually happening, okay?
The YouTube comments, I can't believe they would put this into the game.
Yeah. Okay. And did we miss anything? I think we did the conversation. We did the meta conversation. I think that's about it. I think that'll do it. I think that's going to wrap things up here for now. But yeah, that was something. I don't know. I think that went pretty well. I don't mind that. I think it was good. It was actually a tea time I was somewhat anxious about to an extent, because I think it's really difficult. However, I think we put on our nuance hats and did a good job-ish. I think it was good. Well done, team. I think we have done well. And I really hope this kind of sparks a discussion and a conversation about the metagame. What that is, what that means, how it is. Is it good? Is it bad? What we can do? Maybe what you can do. Maybe what ArenaNet can do to make the game a better place and more cozy for everyone involved. But yeah. There you go. Yeah, beans. Look at this. I like Beanga. Look at him. He's just got, like, it's like a Pepe, but just a can of beans is emptied on his head, and he's smiling. It's good. He's having a good time. He's like, oh, yes, this is good. But anyway, I'm going to start off with the mystery guest here. You have burst onto the scene, Nike, to say things. Mm-hmm. What are you doing these days, outside of surprising us on podcasts?
I've got a lot of secret Guild Wars 2 projects in the work that I can't mention yet.
Oh, wow.
But for the most part,
goodness me,
you can find me streaming Zwift on Tuesday, Thursdays. That's my new schedule. Races on Tuesdays, hard-ass workouts on Thursdays. We can sweat, we can get fit, topless. TOPPLESS.
Okay.
If that lights you up, you know where to find me.
The onion. Oh yeah, the next, the part 2 of the onion farming guide, actually is a.
Which one will not be retweeted by ArenaNet for sure? 0% chance.
You never know. I guess you could just stumble upon it. Maybe.
Okay. Sneb. I say something. What's going on?
Hello. I had a baby a week ago.
Did that hurt?
Well, not for me, but for my wife, yes. But she's doing fine. They're both doing well. So I've been a little bit away from the scene, a little bit. Still going to be streaming on Mondays and Thursdays, and then maybe one weekend day is kind of what I'm thinking. But yeah, busy. Started a new job as well, teaching at a university, which I'm really excited about. And then my other job is starting in a week. So I'm going to be busy guy. But as far as what I'm doing in Guild Wars 2, I make statics, particularly on the NA server. We have over 55 now. So there's over 550 raiders every week playing together for at least 2 hours. Really exciting. And there is a Super Omega secret EU static forming. That's right. You too, my EU friends, could get in on the Skane Gang action and make a static There is a it's super secret though. So it's the pilot one actually. If it goes well, we'll advance and start doing more EU statics. But if you're interested in that, you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the person who's going to lead that. So my Discord is Snebzor6886. Message me if you want to be on the EU static. I don't know when they're going to meet for sure. It looked like Wednesday or Thursday evening EU time. So
wow,
it's your last chance to get away from Jill Adrian if you're on EU. Your only chance.
But yeah, that's what I do. And yeah, you find me on Twitch and Twitter and stuff.
Exclamation mark host in the chat. Oh, there you go. It worked. I was almost. It was a bit delayed there. The bot was slacking. Activating the Doot bot as well. There we go. Boom. And Emmy has been just here in embracing the insanity, enjoying the chaos of the tea time. Huge brain, massive intellect. What are you up to these days?
Petting my cat because he's really hungry. I usually feed him around this time, so he's kind of begging for food right now. Okay. But for those that don't know me, my name is Emmy. I do a lot of endgame PvE shenanigans on the NA server. I stream, or at least I try to stream every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. But recently that schedule has been kind of derailed because I've been playing a lot of teamfight tactics and
Betrayer.
Yeah, I'm too scared to stream it because I feel like people are going to judge me for being dumb. So. But yeah, I'll be back to that. I'll be doing another raid training probably pretty soon. And and a super exciting thing is actually I'm starting a second Harvest Temple progression group. So this is a bunch of people that have never cleared it before. So they're actually going to be progging from the ground up. So I'll be taking the lead on that.
That is huge. That is absolutely massive. And if you haven't decided to go and follow these individuals after this tea time, you're unhinged. I'm just gonna say it. You're unhinged. I mean, I don't use that word lightly. For anyone who watches my stream knows that. I don't just say this word all the time. But yeah, you are. So make sure that you go and follow, watch all the videos, expand your mind, join a static, become the goose. The goose could be loose. Okay, now on EU too. And of course, honestly, join the HTCM static. Just get in there. You can fit like, you can all fit, right? It's fine. Like we can break the game and get like 30 people in there. Yeah.
Just rotate a new person in every 3 polls. That'll work like a charm.
Oh, yeah, yes. In fact, watch Emmy do it, learn from Emmy, and then make your own static. Yeah.
True.
See? Ooh, yeah. That's big, right? That's huge. But anyway,
we might actually have 2 raid league statics starting. Maybe. It depends. There's a bunch of interest now, so we might start getting competitive. And we just had an HDCM group form too. It's pretty.
We've still got to do that thing as well, right? The raid tournament.
Yes, and I have backing stuff if we want it, probably. So
I like that.
Yeah, I've done some stuff behind the scenes.
We've been doing some stuff. A little bit of juice, a little bit, squeezing the goose for the juice a little bit. I like that. Yeah, you should follow the stream as well. That's all I've got to say. You should follow. You should go and subscribe on YouTube and leave a comment on the TeaTime, because actually, a big thing with TeaTime actually is that I do want to really get a lot of good conversations going, particularly about difficult and complicated topics like this. I believe that ultimately, I guess I should have said this at the start, but one of the reasons why these issues are so problematic is because there isn't enough conversation about them. There isn't enough open discourse discussing these things and talking about them. And that is why TeaTime is here. So 1, you should leave a comment on YouTube and tell me what you think. And then we'll all reply to it. It'll be great. Okay. And secondly, you should definitely join my Discord as well, because Teapot Discord is becoming the TeaTime Discord. In fact, the Discord we're in right now, I'm actually migrating it over to that Discord just because I don't want to have a zillion Discord servers. I'm already in like 90, okay? Don't need any more, okay? So yeah, there you go. TeaTime Discord, get in there, discord.gg/teapot. And honestly, maybe I'll get maybe this will be the first one that I actually try and do the new system for. We will create a discussion thread for this TeaTime, and we will all talk about the topics, talk about the ideas discussed. And we're just going to have a great time. We will become scholars, right? Wise, full of wisdom and intellect. That will be you if you join the Discord and join the conversation about this. But that is going to wrap things up for this TeaTime. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Really hope you enjoyed the show. And of course, thank you to my wonderful guests. I think we had an excellent conversation. it was very good. I enjoyed it, although despite being slightly stressed because I actually really care about this one. A lot, actually. But there it is. Thank you so much to Sneb, Emmy, and Bonus Nike for joining at the last second. Thank you so much, gamers, for watching. Take it easy, my friends, and we'll see you next time. I can hear the police in the background coming to arrest me.
Oh, you can hear that?
Illegal yeah, for the illegal topics, okay, that we've been discussing here. But anyway,
Unhinged.
we're out. I've got to run. I've got to run for the police, guys. I'm out.